What he could see of it was colorful, with lines going every which way. There was a strange allure to it, and he stuck his hand in the gap and took it out. He uncrumpled it. Dust came out between the folded crevices. Fletcher blew on the map he was staring at to clear the dust off it. The graphics on this map were in an older style, but it was almost exactly the same as the one they'd used last night. In fact, the "You Are Here" arrow even pointed to Lakewood Cabin. Everything else was there, too. Willow Lake, the trail they'd used to get there, even a giant boulder covered in graffiti they'd passed was on there as a landmark. The biggest difference, and the part that drew Fletcher's eyes, was that someone had drawn in a series of tiny cabins with a Sharpie. Over the cabins was the name Camp Lakewood. This was all done over where the map originally had nothing but trees. Weird, Fletcher said under his breath. He started to fold the map up and put it in his pocket when he heard feet shuffling in the room. "Yo!" Gavin said. He stopped at the doorway. "You okay?" Yeah, Fletcher said, trying to straighten up. "Just can't find the dart is all." "It's right there," Gavin said, pointing by one of the entertainment system's legs where a fluorescent green dart tail was poking out of. "You sure you're all right?" Fletcher forced out a short laugh. "I think maybe I hit the bong a little too hard this morning." "Never that, bro." Gavin smiled at him. "I'll be all right," Fletcher said, relieved he'd bought the lie. "Well, the girls got breakfast ready. Breakfast burritos. Hurry your ass up or I'll scarf down yours too." Gavin laughed and then left the room. Fletcher grabbed the dart from underneath the entertainment system, then put it in the metal bucket with all the others. Before heading back, he took the map out of his pocket and looked it over again. He'd half expected the map to have disappeared from his pocket or disintegrated, but it hadn't. It was still there, mysterious and oddly drawn-in cabins and all. He wasn't sure why, but it felt like he'd found some sort of hidden treasure map. The feeling was similar to when he discovered a new indie band he liked, and he would listen to their discography before telling anyone to check them out, so he could remain the expert on the subject. It was a douchey thing, but the same thing was happening here. He wanted to gander over the map a few times, take in all the details, maybe get a current map and compare so that he could point out the differences to the others when he finally showed them this retro map. There wasn't much point to this because really, no one would care. But in the moment, it felt right. For a second, he wondered if it actually was the pot he'd smoked making him feel like this. Then his stomach grumbled, reminding him of Gav's threat to eat his burrito if he didn't hurry. Putting the map back in his pocket, he raced out to meet the others on the deck. Chapter 28. Nadine was stirred awake by the sound of the barn door rolling open. She sat up, shielding her eyes from the bit of sunlight coming into the barn. It was an odd daytime visit today. Vadius Caudus walked through the barn and set his camo bag down in front of her. The mask he was wearing today was a man's face. It was cracked and dry and looked ready to fall apart. There were stitches running from the top right side of the forehead that went diagonally down to the left cheek, which suggested it had already fallen apart before. The sewing was done so poorly, it looked like a long centipede crawling on the face.
"Good morning,"
he said happily.
"Makeup look pretty still. Pretty.
He bent down and planted a slurping kiss on her cheek. Nadine's stomach turned, but she was thankful that her captor was as petulant as he was. He had no sexual desires, and didn't do anything beyond kissing her, because all he wanted from women was platonic companionship, nothing more. The problem was, he went about achieving it in the worst ways possible. Vadius Caudus unzipped the bag and took out a red dress from it. It was long, with frills on the ends of it and on the sleeves. Nadine wouldn't have ever picked it out for herself and worn it. In fact, Stephen probably would have made fun of her for wearing something like it, but it was undoubtedly a pretty dress.
Mama's favorite dress,
Veriascatus explained to her, holding it up in the air so that the dress flowed down to its length.
You like?
Nadine nodded. She saw his fat lips curl up into a smirk.
Good.
He got up. He put the dress on the shelf where he kept the chainsaw and other tools, then grabbed a hose off one of the bottom levels. He screwed the hose onto the faucet that was only a few feet from Nadine, then walked over to her, leaving the hose coiled like a snake on the ground for the moment.
Bring other girl here today. Have party for Mama's birthday,
Veriascatus told her.
Have to clean you first. You understand?
Yes, Nadine said.
I take clothes off now,
he said. He always announced that he was going to strip her clothes off before he did it. It always came off like he was apologizing for it. Deep down inside, Nadine appreciated the decency. It made her sick with herself to see any shred of humanity in this monster, but maybe that was what the mind did in these situations. It looked for any forms of consolation to outweigh the horrors.
Up, up,
Veriascatus said, reaching around the waistband of her shorts. Nadine complied, and used her stubs to raise her buttocks so he could slip the gym shorts off her. He never put any underwear on her, either because he didn't want to bother with the extra work or because he didn't understand the function of it. Nadine wasn't sure. So she settled back on the ground bare-ass. The floor felt ice-cold against her skin. Next, he started undoing the cuffs around her wrists and her neck. This wasn't as freeing as it may have seemed, because he undid the locks with one hand and pointed a knife at her with the other. Often when he was changing her shirt, she thought about wresting the knife from his grip. But the scenarios played out like movie snapshots in her head with completely different outcomes. In one scenario, she would take the knife from him and be quick enough to slash his throat open. Veriascatus would fall to his death instantly. She'd take the keys from his pockets and unshackle herself, then get out of this demented barn and be back out in the real world. In the second scenario, the one that she knew was the more realistic outcome, Veriascatus would overpower her attempt to snatch the knife and stab her to death. Maybe even worse than that. Maybe her resistance would activate some sort of sexual impulses in him, and he'd do much worse before killing her. Just the thought of that was enough to deter her from trying anything too bold. Things were bad, but she was well aware that they could get worse. He finished undoing all three of the shackles, took her shirt off, cuffed her up again, and then went back to the hose.
Fresh and clean for Mama's party,
Veriascatus said, turning the faucet on. Using his thumb, he blocked some of the hose's opening and aimed it at Nadine. The first sprays of water felt like fingers of a dead person, but after that it got better. Veriascatus sprayed water all over her, but made sure not to wet her face. He didn't want to ruin his makeup job. 15 minutes later, Veriascatus had her dried off, wearing Mama's red dress, and shackled up again. He stepped back to get a good look at her with a big grin on his face. Her captor looked her up and down with admiration, but it wasn't with any sexual desire. It was the way a man might look at his favorite sports car after spending an afternoon washing and waxing it.
Muy bonita, me gusta,
he said, nodding to her.
Mama's party will be fun. Good time. Only one other girl, right?
Nadine said, her voice cracking. She wasn't even fully aware that she'd asked the question until it was already coming out of her mouth, but she had to know. She had to know that he was only planning on bringing one girl back to suffer with her and not anyone else.
Yes?
Vadiaskaras said, then dropped his eyes to the floor. With one finger, he reached into the eye hole of his mask and rubbed under his eye. When he brought it back out, Nadine saw it was wet.
My God, he's crying. I am sorry,
he said.
My brain, it cannot handle taking care of two Barbies.
Vadiaskaras threw himself to the floor, flat on his stomach. His long curly hair, splayed out on the floor, looked like a dead crow lying on his head.
Stupid, stupid, stupid,
he yelled out, smashing his fists against the floor. Nadine felt the floor and the wall behind her vibrate with each one of his strikes, and for a second thought the damn barn was about to collapse and kill them both. The tantrum only lasted a few seconds. Then Vadiaskaras picked himself up off the floor. He punched himself on the side of the head before saying,
I have to let you go when I bring back other Barbie. I am sorry.
He looked at her. His eyes were wet and shiny behind the grotesque mask.
He's talking to me like I'm a pet he has to put down.
Nadine could hardly believe what she was hearing, and the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like that was exactly what was happening. She was a pet to him, nothing more.
No, even less than that. I'm a Barbie doll.
The name finally made sense to her after all this time, and her heart quivered in fear.
I will return later with the other Barbie,
he continued.
Then, tomorrow, after Mama's party, maybe let you go.
Without waiting for her reply, Vadiaskaras headed out. He rolled the barn door shut, staring at her from behind the face that didn't belong to him the entire time. This was one expression Nadine could never figure out, because his eyes were void of any emotion when he was leaving the barn. They were entirely soulless, a pair of dark, dead eyes staring at her from the exit point of her prison. Tomorrow, she might be let go. But there was no promise in his words. There was no promise of a tomorrow for her at all. Chapter 29. Gavin, Fletcher, and Fred were gathered on the front deck, their stomachs filled with breakfast burritos. They were passing a hefty joint around to each other. The weed was really hitting Fred out here in a way he'd never felt it hit him before. But it also didn't help that Gavin had made them all take shots at tequila during breakfast. Either way, the headline of the missing couple article was burning in his mind with an itch he could only scratch by talking about it. Hey, did any of you happen to do any digging around about this cabin? What do you mean? Gavin asked. Man, I saw some creepy article about this place, Fred told them. What are you talking about? You didn't do research on Lakewood Cabin, did you? Fred asked. No, just tell us what you saw. And take a hit and pass it already, Gavin scolded. Fred grimaced, but took a big hit and reached over the picnic table to hand him the joint. Saw something about a couple never returning from this place. Big whoop. Gavin took a big hit of the joint, then passed it to Fletcher. Take a look around us, Fredster. You could get lost looking for a place to take a piss out there. No, dude. I think it was something else, Fred argued. If I had any service out here, I'd pull up the article. What else did you find? Fletcher asked. He felt like the map was burning a hole in the side of his thigh. I don't know, that's it. Why? Did you happen to see anything about a campsite? Fred jogged through his memory. No? Check this out. Fletcher took the map out of his pocket. I found it in the game room behind the entertainment system. He splayed it out on the picnic table, and Gav and Fred gathered over it. Immediately, they noticed the Sharpie cabins and the name Camp Lakewood. "What the hell?" Gavin hooted. Fred took out the map he had in his pocket and put it on the table next to Fletcher's map. They were indeed maps of the same location, with the obvious difference being the graphics and the added-in campgrounds. "What about this?" Fred asked. "I don't know. It's just weird that someone drew this stuff on a map and left it behind," Fletcher replied. Now that Fred had posed the question, he wasn't really sure what his point was. "Must be some abandoned place someone stumbled upon by accident," Fred guessed. "You guys want to go and try to find this place?" Gavin grinned at them. "Well, what if we get lost and don't come back like that couple that disappeared?" Fletcher asked. Gavin burst out laughing. "Fletch, how fucking high are you?" "Pretty high." "Yeah," Gavin continued, "I can tell. Nothing like that is going to happen to us. We'll just find some campgrounds and that's it. It'll be fun." Fletcher shook his head and laughed at himself. "Yeah, you're right. All right, I'm down." He didn't get much time with the map himself, but this was better anyway. A hike through a forgotten trail sounded like a killer idea. "What about you, Fred? You in?" Gavin asked. "Yeah," Fred said, giving in to peer pressure. "Sure, all right. But let's follow the paths on the map. No getting crazy." Yeah, whatever, Fredster," Gavin said, gathering up the maps. They finished the joint, then went inside the cabin to ask any of the others if they wanted to come. Chapter 30. Emerald drove through the woods, driving faster than he realized. Something pulled him like a magnet, and he knew his first location, File 3, as Harold Buckley had labeled it in the email, was where his life's work would finally pay off. He was reminiscing on his years as a psychology graduate student, when his colleagues, and especially the professors, all thought he was insane for his beliefs in the supernatural. Back then, he cared more about what people thought of him and mostly tried to keep his beliefs to himself. But the whole time, he felt something inside of him that he couldn't ever describe, something that told him there was more to this world than just science and psychology, things that wouldn't ever be discovered by those who treated the sciences like gospel. He didn't know what it was then, and didn't know what it was now. But he felt like it would all make sense when they reached the location in File 3's map, when they reached Camp Slaughter. "Emerald, maybe you should slow down?" Molly suggested. She noticed the same thing Nadine Lang had noticed more than a year ago driving down a similar road with her husband speeding. If a car was coming in the opposite direction, they'd have a hard time avoiding a head-on collision. It wasn't like anyone would be driving on the road at the same time, but on the other side of the same coin, totaling a car in such a remote area would make dealing with the aftermath a hassle. "Sorry," Emerald said, lightening his foot off the pedal. "Just a bit anxious to reach our destination." "Yeah, I can tell." It came out in a ribbing tone, but she meant it too. His face was beaming, almost youthful in appearance. She'd never seen him like this before. It helped to calm her own nerves down, but only to an extent. "According to the notes Mr. Buckley provided us, we should be there in just a little while more," Emerald said, glancing down at the directions splayed out on his lap. "Are you prepared for what we might encounter?" Molly's mind went to the revolver sitting in the glove compartment. "Yeah, I guess so." Then she looked out the window and gulped. The trees were endless out there and packed together tightly like an unopened pack of cotton swabs. And the more they drove, the deeper the woods seemed to get, which meant the more likely it was that anything could be hiding out there. "We will be fine," Emerald assured her. We will be, she said. Then, with a weak smile on her face, added, Just make sure you pull your own weight, Emerald. I will try to push these old bones as much as possible. Emerald returned the smile. Those were the last words they said to each other until they reached their destination. Chapter 31. They found the girls in the game room around the ping-pong table. They were holding the paddles and hitting the ball back to each other, but it was more of an activity they were doing between drinking mimosas rather than actually playing. Sound effects from the SNES Wayne and Dalton were playing in a corner of the room filled the air. Overall, the den had the feeling of kids partying bright and early without a care in the world. Gavin burst through the door. We're going hiking! Who's coming? His announcement stopped the girls' game, and Noelle caught the ball mid-air as they all turned their attention to him. What? Brooke said. We're going hiking, Gavin repeated. He unfolded the map Fletcher had found and held it up for them to get a look at. The girls looked at one another in confusion as they tried to figure out what was going on. Fletcher found this map, Fred started to explain. We're going to loot the fuck out of these cabins, Gavin said proudly, but this just confused the girls more. Fred ignored him and snatched the map out of his hand. He laid it down flat on the ping-pong table. The girls came around to where he was and crowded around it, peering over his shoulder. Someone drew in a campsite that isn't on our map, Fred told them, tracing his finger around the added trail. We're going to try to find this path and follow it. See if we find this campsite. What if we get lost? Brooke said. We won't. We have the map, Gavin said. We traveled through the woods out in the dark last night, didn't we? Yeah, I think we'll be fine, Fred said. And if I'm looking at this map right, we weren't even that far from the campground when we were at the lake last night. If it seems too hard to follow, we'll turn back. Noelle looked out of the open windows and saw the sun rays that were still shining down bright through the treetops. She started walking away from the table. I'll take a rain check on this one. I'm way too pale to be out in that bright sun. Put on some suntan and you're good, Gavin said. But he sensed there was another reason she didn't want to go, and it probably had something to do with her confession to Fred at the lake last night. She shook her head and looked over at the TV screen where Wayne was trying to guide Mario through Bowser's castle in Super Mario Bros. 3, with a series of expletives flying out of his mouth. I think I'd rather stay back here and chill with them. Whatever, Gavin said. What about you two? Bet you could use some dope pics for your Instagram, Vanessa. What if we don't find anything there? Vanessa said. We're still hiking through the beautiful woods. We'll get something. After last night's trip, Brooke was excited to explore more of their surroundings, and she really wanted Vanessa to come along with her. Yeah, true. All right, I'm in, Vanessa said. Fred was blown away by Gavin's persuasive tricks working once again. He really was a natural at it. What about you, Dalton? Brooke said to him across the room. He turned from watching Wayne playing. I'm sorry, what? You want to come hiking with us? Brooke repeated the question. Dalton held the controller up to his cousin and shook his head. My turn is up next. Mr. Fun Guy of the Year, Gavin said under his breath. Behind him he heard Fletcher laugh. Brooke shot him an icy glare that made them both go silent. I take it you're leaving Wayne? Why the hell would I want to take him? Gavin said. Before their squabbling could turn into anything more, Fred started moving. Enough messing around. Let's go hike off these burritos. No one protested this, and they all started for their rooms to grab what they needed for the hike. You two really brought some buzzkills to this trip, Gavin teased Fred and Brooke. Fred didn't feel much like defending Noelle. He was still feeling strange about everything that happened, and somewhere in that odd whirlwind of emotions was anger for her. It didn't make sense why she'd even come on this trip with him, or how her boyfriend was okay with it in the first place, until he thought maybe she'd agreed to this trip before their thing got serious and didn't want to bail on him. At least there's that, he thought sourly. Brooke turned around, frowning at Gavin.
Dalton's a poet, not an outdoorsman.
Yeah, well, he could have fooled me with those shirts he wears. Gavin laughed, adding to the insult.
Oh, shut up, Gav,
Brooke said, scaring some birds out of a tree. The command seemed to have worked, not just on Gavin, but the rest of the group as they continued down the path in silence. According to the map, they were only a few yards away from the drawn-in trail. 10 minutes passed. Fletcher pointed off to the side of the path they were on and said, "Look, guys, I think that's it right there." They looked. There was a blanket of overgrown wild grass and moss over it, but the path could still be seen if you knew it was there. Underneath the foliage was hard-packed dirt and bits of gravel like what made up the path they were currently on. "Oh, shit, I think it is," Gavin said, walking past the rest of the group. He peered deeper down the path and noticed the unnatural pattern of cleared trees. "Yeah," Fred said, looking at the map. "This is where the trail is supposed to be, according to the map, just off that bend back there." "Then what are we waiting for?" Gavin asked.
"We're waiting for you to go,"
Vanessa said. Gavin snickered, but when he looked back at the hidden path, he felt a sudden unsteadiness. They had no idea what they would find at the end of the trail. And even worse, what if the trail gradually got more hidden as they progressed through it, until eventually it ended, and they didn't know how to get back? "Come on," Fred said, pushing past him and starting into the trail. "What? Are you afraid?" Gavin shook his head and trotted after him. "No, Fredster, definitely not." Chapter 32. Ignacio approached the cabin from the back. Luckily, he knew the woods well enough that he could navigate them without having to follow any set paths. This gave him the advantage of moving through them without being detected, and allowed him to surprise his prey, as he was about to do now. He heard chatter coming from the front of the cabin, so Ignacio headed in that direction. He peered through one of the den windows. 3 people were gathered in front of the television, 2 boys and a girl. The girl he recognized. She'd been hiking last night with Mama's look-alike. That meant they were part of the same group. Ignacio's brain didn't work right, but that much he could figure out. Before he made a move, Varias Caras wanted to make sure there wasn't anyone else in the cabin. Ignacio crouched down and walked alongside the first set of kitchen windows. The counters were riddled with dirty paper plates, tinfoil, plastic utensils, beer cans, liquor bottles, cups, paper towels, and other evidence of partying, but there was no one there. Ignacio moved on to the next window, which was an opaque one that belonged to the first-floor bathroom. He put his ear, well, the ear of the person whose face he was wearing, up to it. If there was someone inside, they'd likely notice his shadow and start screaming. He listened for the scream. Nothing. Not even the sounds of someone peeing or pooing or washing their hands. Sure that the bathroom was unoccupied, he moved on to the next room. A small study room with books crammed in shelves and a single lazy boy. Also empty. Ignacio continued to move alongside the perimeter of the cabin, peering into rooms. He knew the cabin's layout very well. He'd been here many times. He realized the further away he got from the game room, the stiller the cabin grew. Positive there wasn't anyone else in the cabin, he made his way back around to the den to take another peek. They still didn't notice him. They were too focused on the TV screen. Ignacio counted them with an index finger to make sure they were all still there. 1, 2, 3. Yep, all there. None of them were the mama look-alike, but that was okay. The mama look-alike and the others must have gone out into the woods. That was what campers did when they came out here. Explore. Ignacio would return later to capture her and bring her to the barn. For now, though, his mind turned to the youngest kid in the group. He was younger than the people he usually ran into out here, which meant his meat would be more tender. It would probably fall right off the bone. Ignacio's stomach grumbled. He pulled the machete from the sheath on his back. Wayne was on his last level of Super Mario Bros. 3. The bullets were flying across the screen, trying to get him out of the game. Lakitu was throwing spiked shells from his cloud in the sky, covering the stage with hazards Wayne had to guide Mario safely away from. He was down to his last life, and a few wrong moves meant the dreaded game over screen. His skin was getting clammy, but the controller may as well have been glued in his hands. Wayne was in the zone. But the zone was about to be shattered. As he'd expected, the front cabin door was unlocked. It always was. It didn't make much sense to various Caras, but campers felt safe out here, despite that they were invading the spots of large predatory animals. It was almost as if they feared their own species more than the wild ones. And maybe that made sense, considering what he was about to do to them. Sound effects and video game music filled the otherwise still cabin. Mario jumping, collecting coins, getting power-ups, sounds that reminded Ignacio of childhood. For a moment, he wanted to go in there and play with them.
"We're not here to play, idiota. We're here to hunt,"
various Caras said to him.
Sí,
Ignacio responded aloud, disappointed. He made the innocent part of his mind, the part that was the most Ignacio, go back into its hidey hole. The cabin was built out of such sturdy wood that there was no creaking even underneath his heavy boots, a godsend for someone that enjoyed the element of surprise. He stood out in the hallway, but all three of them were watching the television screen, and just as they didn't notice him at the window, they didn't notice him approaching here either. Various Caras readied the machete. It was killing time. Dalton saw him out of the corner of his eye first. A gigantic man rushed towards them. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't do anything. His brain was too scrambled by fear to send the proper signals to the rest of his body. The only thing he could move were his eyes, and they dropped down to the object the man held in his left hand. It was a machete. Dalton brought his eyes back up to the man's face to see if maybe he didn't have any bad intentions. Maybe he was just a yard worker coming to let them know he was here, and he was being a pussy, as his older brothers called him, for writing poetry. Then his eyes landed on the man's face. There was no expression on it. And even more confusing, it looked stiff as bark. Time seemed to speed up suddenly. Dalton looked back down at the machete in time to see the man's massive knuckles tightening around the handle. His instincts had been right. This was no yard worker at all. The scream finally came out of him, alerting the others. Perhaps too late, but better than never. Chapter 33. At the end of their hike, they found the abandoned campsite. The cabins were run down, looking like they were one stiff breeze away from toppling over. The yards were all overgrown. In some spots it was brown and wispy. In others it was thick and green with plenty of weeds growing out of it. Vines of morning glory grew on the side of the rotting cabins, adding some colorfulness to the otherwise drab scenery. Some of the vines had found holes in the broken windows and continued to grow inside along the floors and walls. The sight was something to behold. The in-between stages of man's abandoned constructions being swallowed up by the beauty of nature. Gavin walked up the porch steps of the nearest cabin. They creaked underneath him, threatening to break under his weight, but they held strong. The floorboards on the porch didn't feel any less rickety as he walked across them either. He stopped in front of one of the windows and blew dust off it, then looked inside. He was looking at a front office. A desk sat in the middle of the room, with sticky notes, computer paper, and pens littered on it. Behind the desk there was an office chair, with a broken headrest that slanted to the right like the head of a man slumbering on a train. In a corner, a bookshelf crammed with trophies, photos of camping groups, and binders sat behind a film of spiderweb. Forgotten paintings of forests and mountains. Stupid, Gavin thought. Why would you put nature inside when it was just outside the window? Decorated the walls of the office and the walls of the corridors he could see. The place somehow looked abandoned and busy at the same time. Almost like the people one day just disappeared in the middle of a workday. More than likely, this was just junk they didn't care about and no one removed. But it made Gavin feel like someone was about to come around the corner at any moment and shoo them away. "Yo, check this out," Fred called to him. Gavin turned away from the cabin, giving it a weary sideways glance before going to join the others. Fred and the girls were standing in front of a sign at the front of the office he'd walked right past. The sign was a 6x6 wooden board that was large enough to greet visitors from a distance. Time and weather had taken its toll on the wood, and pieces of the sign were scattered on the grass island it stood on. There were scratch marks on the top of it where birds had latched their claws on while they basked in the sun and preened themselves. A fading family of 3 was painted on the sign. Their faces and the canoe they rode on were nothing but blurs now. Yellow and blue paint that used to make up the sun and sky behind the family were now just random blotches of colors scattered around them. Maybe, at some point this had been a happy scene, but time had worn that away as much as the wood it was on. Above the family were the words, "Welcome to Camp Lakewood," in a color that once had been golden, but now was a dark brown that blended in with the wood and was almost illegible. Someone had taken care of that, though, and spray-painted the word "Slaughter" in bright red over Lakewood, so that the sign read, "Welcome to Camp Slaughter." "Camp Slaughter?" Fletcher laughed. "Isn't that the title of a Goosebumps book?" "That was Ghost Camp," Fred corrected him. "Oh yeah, right," Fletcher said. "This is a little more, morbid, wouldn't you say?" Fred said. "I wonder who did this, and why they were carrying red spray paint in the first place," Brooke chimed in. "Hey," Gavin said, "do any of you have cell phone service out here?" Fred turned to him, shaking his head. "What the hell kind of question is that? We haven't had cell phone service since we were halfway to the cabin yesterday." "Yeah," Gavin said, taking a look at the abandoned camp that surrounded them. He hadn't been able to kick off the funk peering into the cabin had put him into. "I know. I just was wondering. I guess the people who camped here didn't have cell phone service either." "Probably not," Fred said, taking a closer look at his face. "You all right, man?" Yeah, Gavin said, shrugging. "What? You think I'm scared? Fred laughed it off, but he thought maybe that was the truth considering he brought it up first. No, man, definitely not you. Gavin ignored his sarcasm and to the group said, We just gonna stand here, or are we gonna look around? Yeah, let's see what else we find, Fletcher said.
This place is creeping me out, Vanessa said.
Gavin, afraid the others knew he was creeped out too, started to overcompensate his bravery. It's just a bunch of old cabins. There's nothing to worry about. If anything does happen, I'll protect you. There was a nervous tremble of laughter in the group as they followed him into the campgrounds. They had no way of knowing this, but it was what was going to find them that they should have worried about. Chapter 34. It was Noelle who jumped into gear first. She slammed the game room door shut on the hallway before the man could reach them and threw the lock. Out the windows! She shouted at the boys. Dalton and Wayne had been frozen in terror, with looks on their faces like they'd just shit their pants. But the command shook them out of it. They sprang into action, running to the window closest to them. Dalton was fidgeting with the screen window when a thought occurred to him. Wait! What if there are others outside? Shit! Noelle stopped mid-climb out the window and sat down on the ledge. She swung her legs back inside the cabin. He's right. But there was no time to think. The intruder kicked at the door as if to put an exclamation point on that thought. Bang! 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 The kicks were strong, but the door was holding, for now. Put something in front of the door, Noelle said to Dalton. Dalton understood the change of strategy and ran over to the entertainment system where the SNES was set up. He grabbed it and dragged it across the floor as hard as he could. Finished and polished wood be damned. The TV went crashing off the back as the cord caught at the end of its length. The gaming system went with it. With one final sad electronic glurp, Mario faded to black. Wayne jumped back into the cabin and ran over to the other side of the furniture to help speed up the process. The entertainment system's legs screeched as they sliced streaks into the wooden floor. Meanwhile, Noelle was working on closing the windows, aware that the place would quickly turn into a sweatbox without any air conditioning. Better sweating than dead, she thought. Now that they had the furniture in place and, it seemed for the time being anyhow, that the added weight was successfully holding their intruder at bay, Dalton and Wayne each went to a set of windows to close and lock them. If there were more intruders out there, they could easily break the glass, but they'd at least be alerted of where they were coming from. With the windows secured, they gathered in the center of the room by the pool table, away from any windows in case glass did start flying through the air. Wayne threw his arms around Noelle. He didn't mean it in any perverted way. It was more a gesture of him searching for comfort. He buried his head into her shoulder and cried, I want my mom! I want my mom! Holding on to each other, they both crumpled to the ground. Noelle ran her fingers through his hair and put her head on top of his. Wayne, stop. We'll be okay, we will. She whispered to him, but she didn't believe it herself. Didn't believe it at all, and she started to cry too. Chapter 35. There it is, Emerald called out. They were greeted by the same sign Gavin and company had been looking at a few minutes ago. Both Emerald and Molly read the sign with the graffitiist's fix. Welcome to Camp Slaughter. Emerald could hardly believe his eyes. It was exactly the name Harold Buckley had used. He swallowed. Molly, grab your camera. On it, Emerald, she said, reaching into the back seat. She powered the camera on, hit record, and pointed it at the sign. What are you thinking, Emerald? I'm thinking I've never been to Disneyland. But if I had gone as a child, this is probably how I would have felt, he said. The Subaru came around the last curve before the road straightened out and went up the hill to the campgrounds. Molly looked over her shoulder and saw Emerald's face was flushed red and his eyes were shiny. The stoic man was barely visible in this jubilant face. It was the most excited she'd ever seen him, and all that they'd seen so far was a sign. "The grove is supposed to be somewhere around here," Emerald said. "And in the grove, the cannibals' hideout?" Molly said. "Am I remembering that right?" Yes, precisely," Emerald said. He clutched the steering wheel tighter as he felt the tremble of his organs again. This time, though, he was ready for it, and he kept control of himself. He felt his insides moving, his heart, his lungs, his bones, his blood, his arteries, even the fillings in his teeth. It all moved like people in a stadium doing the wave. Except nothing was physically moving. This was nothing more than a feeling that something supernatural was near. Emerald was sure that's what this new sensation was. It was a sign that he was on the path of his destiny. He'd stayed up all last night looking at the cracks in the ceiling of the shoddy cabin, wondering if he was losing his mind or not, but now he was sure he wasn't. They were going to uncover something huge. Emerald Dantes didn't know this because he could only feel the energy emitting from the campsite. Or rather, the energy emitting from the space the campsite was built on. But they were heading to a part of the earth where spirit energy was collected. A space where the living and the dead world touched each other. It was only a soft touch, a gentle kiss between the two worlds, where only those born with an extra sense could ever feel the interaction. It was a place where lost spirits roamed, waiting for their day to finally cross over into the next realm for good. Emerald and Molly were headed into haunted lands, to put it in simple terms. Chapter 36. Ignacio kicked the door 2 more times, but it wouldn't budge. Whatever they'd put in front of it was too heavy to knock over. He had to get them another way. The machete could hack through the door and make a hole big enough for him to squeeze through. That would take forever. They'd escape out of the room through the windows by the time the hole was big enough. The windows. Yes. He could use the windows to get inside. He made his way out of the cabin and went around to that side of the cabin. He saw his prey huddled in the center of the room inside. What he could see of their faces was pale as horchata. Using the handle of the machete, he smashed a window. The exploding glass got their attention. The girl made a sound that was a cross between a scream and a sob, the cry of fear. Ignacio smiled. The blue-haired guy got up and started for a part of the room Ignacio couldn't see. It didn't matter, he was going to kill them all. He switched the machete onto his other hand and reached inside the window to unlock it. Then, with the same hand, he threw it open. Before he could start to climb inside to begin killing, the blue-haired guy returned, and Ignacio realized the trio wasn't as helpless as he thought. Stupid Ignacio. Dalton heard the glass shatter and knew it was time for him to act. A 14-year-old kid and a petite girl weren't going to be the ones to get them out of this bind, so it was all on his shoulders. As absurd as it was, he heard his brothers laughing at that thought in his mind. Ignoring the laughter, he ran over to the bucket of darts, scooped some up in his hand, and then ran back to the center of the room. The giant man was in the middle of climbing in the window. Without bothering to take aim, Dalton threw a dart in his direction. By some great stroke of luck, the dart went into Variscaris' face, into the side of his mouth where the mask didn't cover. It pierced through his cheek, stopping just short of his tongue. Ignacio screamed and fell backward out of the window, spitting blood into the air. He picked himself up to his knees, pulled the dart from his cheek, and threw it over his shoulder. Trying to ignore the pain in his face, he started back through the window. Dalton launched another dart. Somehow his shaking hands still had true aim. The dart went into Ignacio's brow, right into the exposed part of his face above the right eye. Blood oozed down into it. He didn't fall back this time. Instead, he threw himself through the window like a man on fire diving into water. Out of pure reflex, Dalton threw another dart, but his luck had run out. The dart missed entirely, whizzed past various cars, and went out the window. Ignacio got up to his feet and ripped the dart out of his face. Then he swung the machete through the air in a blind rage. Dalton hopped back, but he was too slow. The machete went through his neck, cutting it open on a diagonal. His head snapped back, tendons in his neck stretched to their limits, like the roots of a stump being pulled from the earth. His head remained attached to his body only by the neck bone and some scraps of skin. Ignacio pulled on the handle of the machete, and since it was still stuck in Dalton, he pulled the kid toward him. At the same time, he punched him in the jaw. The impact was enough to break the neck bone, and the last bits of skin ripped as Dalton's head went flying off his shoulders. The head tumbled through the air, struck one of the walls with a wet splat, and then fell to the ground. It bounced on the floor a few times before coming to a rolling stop. Dalton's face stared up at the spinning ceiling fan with an agonized expression. Ignacio stomped on the lifeless corpse for leverage and pulled the machete out of it. Then he readied it for the next kill. While this was happening, the girl had climbed out of the cabin and was running into the woods. But it didn't matter right now. He only cared about the young kid, the fresh meat. Wayne was halfway out of the window when Ignacio grabbed him by the belt loops of his pants. He yanked on him, but Wayne clung onto the sill with both hands. This was nothing new to Ignacio. They always did this. But he was stronger than them. Always stronger. Ignacio pulled harder. Wayne lost his grip and fell to the floor, hard enough to break one of his ribs. He screamed, but the scream got caught in his throat as Ignacio stomped on his back and knocked the breath out of him. His ribs crunched some more underneath the pressure of the big boot. Wayne tried squirming away from him, but it was no use. The guy was too big and strong. It felt like an anvil had fallen on him. Wayne kicked and punched the air and started to cry, but he knew this was as pointless as the squirming. Ignacio drove the tip of the machete through the back of the kid's neck, all the way through until it stuck in the wooden floor. Wayne's limbs continued to thrash through the air, but it was nothing but his muscles spasming as he died. After a few seconds, his whole body went still. Blood from the wound began to run down and pool around the boy's head, sopping his hair and turning it red. It didn't matter. Ignacio didn't like the head anyway. That was the part of his prey he always threw in the trash after peeling the skin for his masks. Ignacio peered out of the windows to see where the girl was. He could still see her sprinting in the trees, or at least going at a pace that was her version of sprinting. She was slow. He could catch her if he hurried, maybe. But no. The important one was Mama's look-alike, who wasn't here. Which meant he'd have to go looking for her later. For now, though, he was done here. Ignacio returned to the young kid. He pulled the machete out of his neck, then chopped his head off. No point in keeping it attached. With one hand, he lifted the boy up and put him on his shoulder. He started out of the den, glancing over at the headless body that used to belong to the blue-haired kid in the middle of the room. He'd have to leave it behind, unfortunately. Ignacio didn't like leaving corpses behind. That was one thing Mama had drilled into him. Don't play with your food and don't waste any.
Hay gente que no tienen de comer.
There are people who don't have anything to eat. And here he was, walking away, leaving behind a perfectly full human body that would have fed him for weeks. It didn't feel good to waste food. It didn't feel good at all. Chapter 37.
What is that?
Molly said. looking around the camera and pointing at what appeared to be people moving between the cabins in the distance. "Hikers," Emerald said, throwing her a sideways glance. "Did you think it was spirits?" Molly laughed.
No, screw you, Emerald. Just taken by surprise. Nobody's supposed to know where this place is.
"Right. So, shall we find out what they're doing here?" It was more of a statement than a question, considering he was unfastening his seatbelt as he spoke. They were parked in front of the Camp Slaughter sign, and a quick glance at the cabins that made up the place confirmed that this was indeed the spot Harold Buckley had told them about. Emerald had sobered up from the high of finding the place, and though he no longer felt the wave of energy going through him, he still had the sense that there was something supernatural here.
"Yeah, let's go talk to them,"
Molly said. Then she started reaching for the glove compartment where they kept the revolver. "No need for that," Emerald said, lifting his shirt up to reveal the pistol holstered to his hip. "This should be enough. You bring that with you." He was referring to the camera.
"And if they're dangerous, you think I'll be able to record them to death?"
Molly retorted. "I don't think it's necessary we stroll up to them strapped like cowboys," Emerald said. "Please, Molly, we need to capture this. All of this."
"All right,"
Molly said, seeing his face weakening.
"Okay, fine. But I better not regret this."
"I'll do all of the talking. You just stay back and record. It'll be fine, I promise." Molly didn't respond, just climbed out of the car. On the driver's side, Emerald did the same. Like the first cabin Gavin had peered into, the campgrounds looked like they'd been abandoned in the middle of a busy day. Targets in the archery range still had arrows sticking out of their grimy, faded faces. There was a small lake near the campground with a lonesome, filthy canoe sitting on its bank. Gavin and Fletcher went up to one of the lodging cabins, which were much smaller than the office cabin, and peered inside it. Most of the space inside was taken up by a bunk bed that had collapsed on itself. A mess of splinters stuck out from the support columns where they'd broken. Seeds and spores had found cracks in the floor and grown into wildflowers and fungi. By the looks of it, this was the only life the cabin had seen in years. "Want to go inside?" Gavin said. Fletcher looked away from his window and over at Gavin to see if he was serious. "For what?" "I don't know," Gavin shrugged. "Just to see what else we find." Fred was coming up the porch steps to join them and heard Gavin's suggestion. "Man, you always have to be messing around, huh?" "What?" Gavin whirled around to face him. "Come on, Fredster. It's not like we're going to get in trouble." "Let's just leave it alone," Fred said. "I don't get it. Why?" Fred shrugged. "I don't know. It just feels wrong to disturb things around here." Gavin knew what he meant, which was the reason why he wanted to do it. The only way he'd ever known how to deal with uncomfortable feelings was by confronting whatever was making him feel that way. And right now, these stupid campgrounds were doing it to him. He'd feel better kicking down one of these cabin doors. "Just leave it alone," Fred repeated. "Let's just go take pictures with the girls over there." The girls were out in front of another cabin, taking selfies for Vanessa's Instagram. Despite their initial resistance, they seemed to be having a good time. A better time than even the guys, and were laughing and joking as they looked over the pictures on their phones. "Now who's acting scared, Fredster?" Gavin smirked. But just as quickly as the smirk came, it disappeared. His lips went flat as he saw a light in the distance. Because of the strange mood the place had him in, he thought it was something supernatural for a second. But no, It wasn't anything supernatural, just as surprising, though perhaps not as frightful. It was a pair of headlights. The lights went off, and all Gavin was looking at now was the front of an old car parked outside the campgrounds. "What the hell?" Gavin said. The car seemed to have come out of nowhere. In their distraction, none of them had even heard it coming. This was strange. Fred and Fletcher turned around to see what had his attention in time to see the Subaru. "Whoa! Who is that?" Fred said. "How should I know?" Gavin snapped. "Should we get out of here?" Gavin's response was to climb down the cabin porch steps and walk over to the girls, who, as of yet, hadn't noticed the unexpected visitors. "Hey, girls, sorry to cut your photo shoot short, but we got company," he said, approaching Vanessa and Brooke. The girls put their phones down and looked at Gavin's face to see if he was serious. They saw the other boys coming toward them behind Gavin with similarly long expressions.
"What? What are you talking about?"
Brooke said. "Look." Gavin pointed behind them. They spun around and nearly jumped out of their shoes when they saw the vehicle.
"Oh, shit," Vanessa said, hopping backward. "Are they park rangers?"
The car doors opened and they saw an older man wearing a chauffeur hat and a Hawaiian shirt getting out of the driver's side. From the passenger side, a thin blonde woman got out. The object around her neck flashed underneath the sunlight. If Gavin hadn't seen the headlights first, the way this object shined would have made him think about ghosts. "No way they're park rangers," Gavin said, getting a second look at their visitors. "Not dressed like that." The others agreed. The old man looked like he'd just gotten off a plane from his first trip to Thailand, rather than someone dressed to deal with trouble in the woods. But that realization only made this all more confusing.
"We should get the fuck out of here," Vanessa said, chewing on the nail of her index finger.
"No," Gavin said, stepping in front of the group. "We have as much right to be here as they do."
"Gav, what are you doing?" Fred asked.
"This is no time to be stubborn. Shut up, Fredster." Gavin took a few more steps toward the pair of strangers. Less than 20 yards separated the two groups now. Gavin puffed his chest out some and then yelled out, "Hey, who are you?" To his surprise, and to the surprise of the others, the old man stopped in his tracks. Emerald sensed the fear coming from the boy, the one he was thinking of as the leader of the group. He could almost feel the fear in the air, and he thought of the wave that had vibrated through his body. Surely that had something to do with his suddenly heightened perception. And more than that, there was no doubt in his mind this camp was the cause of it. They were standing on grounds that had inexplicable powers, or perhaps grounds that had awoke latent abilities in people. Emerald wasn't sure which one it was, but that was something he would ponder later. Right now, he had to figure out who these campers were and what they were doing here. The leader shouted a question aggressively at them, and Emerald stopped with about 20 yards between them. The group looked like nothing more than some young adults hiking on a summer day, but with how much fear was exuding from them, he was worried they might go into attack mode at the drop of a hat. Better to approach them with caution.
"Not quite the ghosts we were expecting," Molly said.
Emerald looked over at her. Her face, and the energy he could feel coming from her, suggested she was the same old Molly as she always was. She wasn't experiencing anything close to what he was, which supported his second theory that these grounds were awakening something in him rather than creating them. "No," Emerald said, "but even the least ferocious animal can be dangerous when threatened." Hey assholes, did you hear me? The leader shouted at them. At some point when they'd been talking to each other, the boy had picked up a long stick from the ground. He held it in his hands like it was a sword. Please, young man, there's no need for such a language and hostility, Emerald said, taking a few steps closer. Hey, don't move until you tell us who you are. Sure, Emerald said. My name is Emerald Dantes. The young lady behind me is Molly Sanger. We're filmmakers out here doing a documentary on this abandoned campground. Filmmakers? It was Fred who asked the question. Gavin grimaced at him. Seeing the boy relaxing his posture, Emerald dared to get a little closer. Yes. As you can see, my partner has a camera with her. I assure you we come in peace. He smiled at them, and now he felt the group dynamic change. The emotion in the air went from fear and anxiety to interest and curiosity. Except for the leader, who still seemed riled up. If you don't mind, Emerald said to them, we would like to get closer to the camp. Perhaps at a closer distance we can have a clearer conversation, and I can better explain what we're doing out here. I wish somebody would explain all this, Vanessa blurted out. Gavin turned to her and shot her a dirty look that she ignored. There was a murmur of agreement between the group, and then, to the chagrin of the leader, they were inviting Emerald and Molly to come join them at the camp. Well done, Molly said. Sometimes it just takes the right words to get the job done, Emerald said as they started up to meet with the group. What are you guys doing? Gavin hissed. He was pissed off at all of them, but especially Fred and Vanessa for being at the forefront of the invitation. You guys have no idea who these creepos are. Chill out, Fred told him. That guy looks as threatening as my grandpa, and that woman looks like a spin class instructor. Gavin pushed past them. I'm getting out of here. If it turns out those two ask you to be in some weird-ass outdoor porn movie, don't say I didn't warn you. No need to fret, young man, Emerald said. He was standing at a comfortable conversation distance from the group now. Of course you're free to leave if you have no interest. Damn right I'm free to leave, Gavin said, laughing. I don't need your permission, old man. Sayonara. He marched towards the path they'd hiked to get here. Wait, Gav, Brooke called after him, but it was no use. He kept on going ahead as if he hadn't heard her. To the others, Brooke said, I'm going to go with him. Maybe I'll be able to convince him to come back. Don't bother, Fred said, knowing how stubborn Gavin was. He doesn't have the map, though. What if he gets lost? Oh well, Fred said. That's on him. He's a big boy. Geez, that's a bit harsh, don't you think? Yeah, man, Fletcher agreed. Maybe we should go get him. Fred clenched his hands into fists. Up until now, he hadn't been looking at anyone directly in the face, but now he turned to look at Brooke and Fletcher. There was a rage inside of him that had been building up that he wasn't aware of until now. Anger at being rejected by Noelle, anger at Gavin for being a big baby, anger at the others for wanting to bend to Gavin's whim, anger that he wasn't sure he'd land a job after college and he might be working at that computer shop the rest of his life, anger at the uncertainty of his future. But there was one more underlying factor to his anger, something he couldn't pinpoint. Fred Myers didn't know this, but it was the power of these campgrounds, of Camp Slaughter, channeling through his body and twisting his emotions into a bottleneck that was about to pop. Fuck him, Fred yelled. Then he cupped his hands around his mouth, and to Gavin he yelled out, You hear me? Fuck you, you pussy! Gavin half turned around but didn't say anything. Instead, He just turned back around, glad that he was too far for them to see the hurt look on his face. The others were stunned into silence. Chapter 38. While the group had been splitting up and quibbling, Emerald had wandered into the campgrounds. They'd done it. They'd found Camp Slaughter. They were going to be the ones to put the kibosh on the debates of its existence. But as he looked around, he wondered at what cost. Dominating it all, because it was the biggest building, was a large wooden cabin labeled Dining Hall. The other structures were scattered around the dining hall, the angle of their placement making a rough circle. Behind them, the way they'd come in from, was the camp office. It sat several yards away from the core campgrounds. Behind the lodging cabins on the east side of the campgrounds, there was a broken and ruined playground. Steps were missing in the rope ladder leading up to a rusty slide. Some of the jungle gym platforms had holes in them. The monkey bars were rusted. The swing set was missing all of its seats, so that the only thing that remained were chains hanging from a bar. What once would have been a playset for children now looked like a collection of death traps and torture devices. And really, the playground told the story of the camp as a whole. There was no joy left in this place, even in the spots made pretty by nature's touch. Anything that may have been painted colorfully was now faded. The wood on the cabins was spotted dark and swelled like skin suffering from leprosy. In some instances, the wood was so bloated it had burst open and begun to splinter. With no electricity in them, the insides of the cabins were dark. It didn't matter that it was summer and the sun was out in full force. There were corners inside, far away from windows, that hadn't seen an ounce of light in years. No longer were the cabins filled with laughter and chatter from campers. The grassy hills, now covered rampantly by weeds, would never be rolled down or played on by children. At night, families wouldn't be gathered around the fire pits, roasting hot dogs and melting s'mores. There was no life left in the place. Camp Slaughter. A fitting name indeed, Emerald thought, drawing in a deep breath. In the coming minutes, though, the name would make even more sense. Chapter 39. Noelle was laying flat on top of a boulder. She had no idea where she was. She'd heard the screams from inside the cabin as she'd climbed out the window and bolted into the woods and ran as fast as she could with no idea of her direction. At the time, it seemed like her only option. If there were others with the machete man, her only chance at survival would have been to outrun them. So she'd ran until she felt like her lungs were going to explode and her knees were going to break. She'd finally stopped in the middle of a small clearing of trees with a giant boulder in the center. She climbed on top of it for no reason other than to avoid being bitten by a snake or a rodent. Now, she was listening for any signs of someone approaching. But there was nothing. Only her heartbeat slowing down with each breath she took. In the distance, nuts and fruits clattered against tree branches as they fell from trees. Chipmunks scurried through the shrubbery, and a woodpecker's knocks echoed through the woods. But other than that, there was nothing alarming happening around her. Noelle let out a deep sigh, but at the end of it there wasn't relief the way she thought there would be. Instead, a wave of guilt filled her. She left Dalton and Wayne behind. Even after she told Wayne they'd be okay. Now he was probably dead. Correction, they were probably dead. She'd ran and left them behind. Left them there to die. Just like she'd done to her little sister Rachel. Noelle buried her head in her arms and wept. Chapter 40.
Your movies go on YouTube? Vanessa asked the filmmaker duo excitedly.
Yeah, Molly said, but she was distracted by the same thing that had Emerald's attention. Emerald was at the edge of the campgrounds, staring out into the distance. About half a mile away from them was a grove of trees. The trees were packed together tightly, and the treetops crossed each other in a way that almost made it look like they were creating a giant thatched roof. In the middle of this grove, there was a shoddy farmhouse. If she took a picture of where they stood from this house, something told her the distance would be the same as in the ear necklace picture Harold Buckley had showed them. And if that were true, that meant... Molly gulped.
How many subscribers do you guys have?
Vanessa asked. Since Emerald explained to them what they were doing out here in Camp Slaughter, the Instagram girl was peppering them with non-stop questions about the YouTube channel and kept reminding them how much it sucked that there wasn't any service out here to check it out. The others seemed enthused, but their excitement was dwarfed in comparison.
Around 100,000 or so, Molly said.
She walked up next to Emerald, away from the group before another question was flung at her.
Are you thinking what I'm thinking?
She said to him. I believe so, Emerald said. Before we go there, I want to see what's inside that barn. Until he pointed at it, Molly had somehow missed the big barn on a field between where they stood and the farmhouse. The barn looked to have been built in the same fashion as the other structures on.
You've come far in the story. Let this quiet melody carry you through a moment of peace. Thanks for being part of our audiobook family.
The campgrounds, and was just as weathered and worn, except for the door, which looked new, and stuck out even from this distance. There's something going on here, Emerald said. He meant two things at once, but wasn't going to bring up the supernatural feelings to Molly, not unless she did so first. What he was referring to was that all the evidence was adding up to human activity in the vicinity.
Yeah, Molly concurred. Maybe our friend Harold turned out not to be such a kook after all, huh?
Get the camera ready, Emerald said, and they both started towards the barn.
Hey, I thought you guys were going to interview us,
Brooke called out to them. Without turning around, Emerald shot his hand out in the air in a quick dismissive wave. After our preliminary investigation, youngsters. The group all looked at one another, unsure of what to do now. Should we go with them? Fred suggested. Why not? Fletcher said. It's not like there's much to look at here. The rest of them showed their agreement with this decision by following behind the two filmmakers. Chapter 41. Now that he was getting closer to the campgrounds, Ignacio's super hearing picked up on the chatter somewhere in the woods. Human voices had a funny way of traveling. They bounced off tree trunks and echoed in a way that made them sound like they were coming from every direction. It was confusing to find where they were coming from sometimes. Worse than that, Variascatus was nowhere to be found. That part of his brain had gone to sleep after the killings back at the cabin.
Wakey, wakey, please,
Ignacio pleaded with the monster inside of him, but it was no use. Ignacio was on his own for now, so he continued walking through the woods. He was following the shortcut from the cabin back to the campgrounds, and the closer he got home, the easier it was to zero in on where the voices were coming from. He walked in that direction, stepping as lightly as he could.
Oh, no, 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 no,
Ignacio thought as he spotted the group walking across the field toward the barn. They were going to find his Barbie.
This is not good, not good, not good. Varias caras, I need help. Please help, please.
But there was no reply. Varias caras was still slumbering. Ignacio crouched behind the bushes. He dropped the kid from his shoulder. There was a heavy thud as the dead weight crashed to the ground. Ignacio pulled the mask off his face, then put it back on several times, hoping that in some way this would wake Varias caras. It didn't. This whole mess was up to him to fix. He looked over at where the people were. There was no doubt they were going to inspect the barn. And each second he wasted, they got closer and closer to it. He had to act. There was less than a quarter mile of trees between him and the field where the group were walking. If he was quiet, he would catch them by surprise. Yes, that would certainly make things easier. But that didn't mean it was going to be easy. Ignacio unsheathed the machete from his back, then started toward them. Chapter 42.
This isn't the big sister I remember.
Rachel's voice stirred Noelle out of the wallowing in her own pity. She lifted her head up and saw her little sister standing underneath a shaded area in the woods. The right side of her face was shiny, from blood no doubt, even though she couldn't make out the color because of the shadows of the trees cast over Rachel's face.
Rach, what are you doing out here?
She wiped the tears from her eyes. The tears were cold. How long had she been sitting here, wasting time feeling sorry for herself? She wasn't sure, but she knew it was too long.
Don't you know by now that I'm always with you, Noelle?
Rachel laughed.
Oh, yeah,
Noelle said. The truth was, in the panic of everything that had happened to her, she wasn't sure of anything.
You're not real. I guess that depends, doesn't it?
Noelle sat up on the rock and shook her head. It was just like her little sister to talk in confusing riddles.
What are you talking about? I'm a manifestation of your anxiety and guilt, and those two things are real, aren't they?
Rachel stepped out into the light, letting Noelle get a better look at her. Rachel's right eye was out of its socket, dangling down like a paddle ball. The entire right side of her body was covered in lacerations oozing with blood. The white sock sticking above her Chuck Taylors was drenched red.
You left them behind just like you did to me, Noelle,
Rachel said, grinning. Noelle clenched her fists.
Stop it. Stop. This is your second chance.
Rachel started pacing back and forth, every few steps hiding her back in the shadows, but no matter the lighting, Noelle could see her perfectly white teeth in her grinning mouth.
What are you going to do, Noelle? Run away and let them die, just like you did to me? Stop!
Noelle covered her ears and buried her head between her knees.
I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to leave you there. But you did, big sister. That's all that matters. All that matters is what you did, not what you meant. Stop!
Noelle opened her eyes for the first time ever, hoping her sister was gone. To her surprise, the hallucination had vanished. It was just her in the woods again. She took in a deep breath and sighed. But as she did that, she saw a shadow crawl its way over her. Noelle turned and saw her little sister wasn't gone at all. No. In fact, she was closer than ever. Rachel was sitting on the boulder next to her, her legs dangling off the edge and facing away from her. Noelle saw that there were splatters of blood on the back of Rachel's head and tank top.
Do you remember the summer when we stayed up way past our bedtime and you would read Shakespeare to me?
Rachel asked her. She remembered that summer very well, and she wanted to say so, but she couldn't. The nostalgic feelings, the sad nostalgic feelings, the question brought with it had her tripped up. Her tongue felt too heavy to move, and an eruption of fresh tears threatened to come out of her.
Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once.
Rachel looked over her shoulder. Her long auburn hair was covering the damaged side of her face, while the good side was in plain sight, grinning at Noelle.
That was my favorite part. Go back to the cabin, big sister. Be valiant. I know you can be.
Before Noelle could respond, her little sister disappeared into thin air. Noelle waited a few seconds to see if the hallucination was gone for good. When she was sure it was, she slid off the boulder and scanned the area she was in. Trees as far as the eye could see. She thought this must be how someone lost at sea felt, trapped in a seemingly directionless expanse.
I have no idea where I'm going, Rach.
Noelle was whispering, like she always did when her sister visited her. She didn't want others to think she talked to herself, although she was aware that was exactly what she was doing when talking to her hallucinations.
Just pick a direction and go, she told herself. What's the worst that can happen?
Noelle started walking, moving steadily away from the boulder she'd been laying on. She thought, and hoped too, that she was right about where the cabin was. If not, she might be lost for hours, maybe days. Shit, she might even get lost in these woods forever. A lump cold as hail formed in the pit of her stomach at the thought. Chapter 43. "We're here investigating a possible cannibal hideout," Emerald said to the group as they marched towards the barn. "You think he lives in a barn?" Fletcher asked dryly. Emerald shook his head and pointed at the farmhouse that was another 50 yards behind the barn. He was doing this for the college kids, but also for the camera. "If a cannibal lives in these woods, the likely place is over there." Molly was walking ahead of them so that her camera was capturing footage of Emerald and the campers making their way to the barn, stepping backward to keep them in the shot. At the same time Emerald pointed and the campers turned their attention to the farmhouse, Molly turned around and pointed the camera at it. She zoomed in on the trees, even though she was afraid of what she might see. But the zoom-in didn't reveal anything except more details of the rundown farmhouse. "Then, why are we going to the barn?" It was Fred who asked. "As an investigator," Emerald explained, "it is my duty to look into anything that seems peculiar." They all knew what the old man was talking about and why he wanted to inspect the barn. The door on the structure looked newer than the rest of the damaged wood making up the structure. Fred and company hadn't seen the picture of the ear necklace dangling in the woods, so they didn't quite understand the consequences of what this might have meant the same way. But they knew something was odd about it.
"What do you think we'll find in there?"
Vanessa asked. Her and Brooke looked at each other and giggled nervously. The story of a cannibal was nothing but fun and games for the campers. For now, anyway. "I don't think anything. I make no assumptions. I just investigate," Emerald told her. "Rad answer," Fletcher said, nodding in approval. They reached the barn and stopped in front of it. Up close, the damage the structure suffered from the weather elements was more noticeable. Some of the wood had been waterlogged and was bumpy, while other spots, mainly on the roof, were milky white from having been bleached by the sun. Slick, bright green moss grew between the walls and the roof, and there was a musty smell hovering over the structure. None of them were sure if it was coming from inside or outside, or both. Maybe it was the isolation, but there was something more unnerving about this dilapidated barn than even the cabins behind them. "Let's see what's behind door number 1, shall we?" Emerald wished he hadn't made that joke. His nervous energy was showing through. He made a mental note to ask Molly to edit that out of the movie later. He reached out to undo the lock on the barn door, but stopped halfway there when Molly shrieked. Everyone turned to look at her as she dropped her camera. She was pointing out into the woods, her mouth agape. Almost in unison, they all diverted their attention to the spot her index finger was directing them to. A figure, obscured by the shadows it stood under, stared back at them. "What the fuck is that?" Fletcher yelled. And then everything seemed to speed up before their eyes as the man emerged out of the woods, machete in hand. Nadine opened her eyes, waking up to the sound of people talking outside of the barn. She sat up unbelieving. It had been so long since she'd heard anything other than rain pelting the barn rooftop, animals scurrying around, her chains clanking, or her captor's voice, that the voices outside the barn sounded like an alien language to her ears. But it wasn't an alien language. It was English they were speaking. Plain American English. Nadine tightened her diaphragm, opened her mouth, and was about to scream to let people know she was in here, when someone else, someone outside with them, beat her to the punch. The scream was so loud and foreign to the quiet world she was used to that it hurt her eardrums. She clapped her hands over her ears, realizing that this unknown screaming was worse than the total silence, because the unknown sometimes brought danger with it. The mask he was wearing was undoubtedly the face of someone else covering his own face. The weapon he carried had flecks of dried blood on it from his latest victims. If this person approaching them wasn't a legitimate giant, then there was no such thing outside of mythology. "Run!" Fred screamed, and they did exactly that, except for Emerald, who fired at the maniac. The shots were wild and aimless and missed completely. Panic flooded him, then he too was running for his life. They scattered in each and every direction. No one worried about maps or where they were heading or if they would get lost in the woods. Survival was all they had on their mind. She was here. Now that he was closer to the group, Ignacio saw her. Mama's lookalike was here. They ran like roaches scattering through a suddenly lit kitchen, their bodies and clothes turned into blurs of color, heading in a direction that they hoped would take them to safety. Whether it was distance from him or a spot that would hide them from his eyes, it didn't make a difference. There was no way he was going to catch all of them, but that didn't matter. The only one that mattered was Mama's lookalike. She was running toward some trees east of the campgrounds, screaming at the top of her lungs, not realizing that her screaming would make it easier for him to follow her. He took off running in that direction. Behind him, he heard gunshots. Ignacio looked over his shoulder in time to see the old man start running away from him. Fear had made him give up on trying to kill Ignacio. Good. He was in the clear to chase Mama's lookalike now. "Ven, vámonos a jugar," he called after her, the words echoing through the woods. Come, let's play. Vanessa heard him huffing and puffing behind her as he chased her through the woods. Why me? Why? She thought. Her head felt light, like it was ready to pop. Her legs were turning to jelly with each step, but it wasn't from exertion of the sprint. She ran regularly as part of her workout regime. It was fear doing this to her. Hours of running a day, pushing through when she wanted to quit, eating salads for lunch, it all added up to nothing Fear trumped all. Vanessa felt huge hands wrap around her neck, and then she was pulled down to the ground. Ignacio grabbed her. Her skin was so soft and smooth. It gave him a tingly feeling in his groin like he'd never felt before. But before he could get too excited, Varias Caras awoke.
We have to focus, estúpido.
He pulled the girl down to the ground as hard as he could, then jumped on top of her and squeezed her neck with both hands. The girl stared up at him with almond-colored eyes that were pleading, while her hands clawed at his arms to fight off the choke. Her nails dug deep enough to break his skin and draw blood, but that didn't do anything except anger Varias Caras. Vanessa felt consciousness slipping out of her. Her scratching had done nothing. His grip hadn't loosened a bit. If anything, it had gotten tighter. So instead, she closed her eyes and waited to pass out. It was better to do that than to continue to stare at this monster's soulless eyes behind the disgusting mask on his face. The girl went limp. He took his hands off her throat and got up. She was sleeping, but not dead. Good. With her taken care of now, he shifted his focus and listened for the sounds of the others. He heard them running through the woods. He could catch some of them if he hurried. None of them moved very fast. But no, he had Mama's look-alike. A good hunter knew when enough was enough. He'd let the others go. They didn't matter anyway. He picked up the girl and threw her over his shoulder, then headed for the barn. It was time to celebrate Mama's birthday. Chapter 44. The stories of the cannibal were true. He was here in the flesh, a gargantuan man wearing a mask made from the face of one of his victims. His long hair was a curly mess on his shoulders. His pants were filthy. After missing his first shots, Emerald had run to hide behind a thicket of bushes, terrified by the reality of the situation. But he had his bearings back now, and knew the girl needed his help. Emerald peeked over the bushes and saw the cannibal putting Vanessa on his shoulders. It was too risky to take a shot from where he was. He might hit her, considering his poor aim. He had to get close enough that he wouldn't miss the cannibal. Maybe with the threat of the gun he could persuade the maniac to put the girl down, and then shoot him in the chest. It was crazy, but he couldn't just run out of here and leave an innocent girl to die. Emerald got out from behind the bushes and walked over to where he was, slowly inching toward the cannibal. Like some sort of illusion, he seemed to grow the closer Emerald got to him. But he had the upper hand, because in the excitement of catching his victim, the cannibal had let his guard down. He didn't notice Emerald approaching him. "Take your hands off the girl," he said, aiming the gun. He and the cannibal were about 2 arms' lengths away from each other. Varias Caras finished putting the girl up on his shoulders like a fireman, and then turned around to face Emerald. His eyes grew big behind the mask when he saw the pistol pointed at him. "Put her down," Emerald said again, trying to make it come out like a barked order. But there was a nervous quake at the end he couldn't hide.
What?
Varias Caras said, kneeling down. With one arm, he started putting the girl down. Meanwhile, his free hand felt around the ground for the machete he'd put to the side. He did this while never taking his eyes off Emerald. Emerald aimed at the cannibal's arm and pulled the trigger, but his hands trembled too much to aim properly and he missed. The bullet struck the ground a few inches from where Varias Caras' hand was. Grains of dirt flew up into a cloud. Varias Caras leapt up from his crouch and lunged forward with the speed of a panther. Emerald shot again. The bullet struck the giant man in the shoulder, but it didn't stop him, so he fired again. The bullet tore through the cannibal's body near his ribs. Blood sprayed from the wound and started leaking down his body, but the cannibal persisted. Varius Carus swung the machete through the air. The blade went through the hand Emerald was holding the pistol with and chopped it right off at the wrist. The dismembered hand went through the air, an arc of blood following its trajectory before it hit the ground with a meaty thump. Emerald screamed and backed away, but the cannibal continued forward. He felt like a wall was about to collapse on top of him, and he knew death was imminent. Varius Carus grabbed him by the throat and lifted him up into the air. Emerald tried to fight the grip off, but before he could lift his arm up, he was launched through the air at a tree. There was a thick, broken branch protruding out of the tree, with a sharp end like a javelin. The point went through Emerald's back and came out of his stomach. Several feet of his intestines were pulled out of his body as inertia slid him down the branch. They unraveled and hung from the tree like morbid vines. When his momentum stopped, he still had enough life in him to be aware of what was happening. Emerald could see his blood and guts slicked on the branch coming out of his body, and feel his legs dangling in the air. He felt like his body had been split in two, and he was becoming one with the tree. Then he began to cough, and a torrent of blood poured out of his mouth. Varius Carus approached him with the machete readied. He drove the blade down through the middle of Emerald's head, splitting it open. Emerald slumped over, dead. The tree branch was the only thing keeping his body from crashing to the ground. Varius Carus pulled the machete out of his skull with a twist. There were a few pops, followed by the muddy sound of the blade dislodging from the skull. Now that the rush of the kill was over, he felt the pain from the bullet wounds. He dropped the bloodied machete to the ground and fell to his knees. Ignacio put his hand over the wound in his rib, the one that hurt the most, and felt the warm blood seep through the spaces of his fingers. This was bad. Stupid, stupid Ignacio. Why did he have to try to fight a man with a gun? He should have run. He stayed there for a few seconds like a three-legged dog, with his right hand over the wound on his side, listening to his labored breathing, wondering if he was going to live or not.
Levántate, hijo. No te dejes.
Mama. She was talking to him. Her spirit was near. He could feel her even closer than when he prayed to her head. She'd come to make sure her son was okay. Ignacio was invigorated by this, and suddenly the bullet wounds weren't as bad. He picked himself up, bringing the machete with him, and strapped it to his back all in the same motion. Then he turned his focus back to the girl, and his heart nearly jumped out of his throat. She was gone. Varius Carus dropped down to his knees and screamed at the top of his lungs. The pain of having had Mama's look-alike and losing her was worse than the bullet wounds.
No, no, no!
Wildlife in the vicinity, hearing his cries, flew or scurried from their hiding spots in a mad dash to get away from whatever was making those awful, awful sounds. Chapter 45. He was back on the normal trail, but the sound of the gun was loud enough that Gavin heard it. It made every hair on his body stand up. He turned around, and when he saw someone there, he almost screamed, but then he realized it was Brooke. She was sprinting down the path towards him, still several yards away, but even from this distance he knew something was wrong. Her skin was as pallid as used charcoal, and she looked about ready to keel over and throw up at any second. "Yo, Brooke, what's going on? Where are the others?" he shouted at her. His first thought was that the old man and his accomplice had turned out to be perverts, but that didn't explain why Brooke was by herself. It also didn't explain the gunshots, and he realized how stupid that thought was. He stretched his neck out to see if maybe the others were in the distance coming behind her, but there was no one, just Brooke. Brooke was close enough now to hug him. She threw her arms around him and buried her face into his shoulder. She was dry-heaving, but held enough composure to talk.
Gav, we need to get the fuck out of here.
What's going on? He said, putting his arms around her and bringing her close to him. She shook her head. Something bad had happened. Gavin felt his balls begin to shrivel up into his body, and his mind raced with the worst thoughts possible, imagining the others had been shot dead.
Some guy, this huge freaking guy, came out of the woods with a machete. We all ran. Oh, damn it, Gav. We all should have left with you. God damn it.
Whoa. Slow down, Brooke. Despite his words, the thoughts in his mind were coming faster now. What are you talking about?
Emerald, the old man we met at the camp, he told us about this cannibal in the woods, and he's real, Gavin. He's real. He came running after us.
Gavin stepped back to examine her face. Are you shitting me? She shook her head.
We need to get the hell out of here.
Where are the others? Gavin said. He could hardly believe this.
I don't know. We all just started running. He had a machete.
Brooke broke into a sob. Recounting it was too much for her to contain. We can't just leave them, Gavin said.
Then you go back,
she said, breaking away from him and starting down the path.
I'm getting out of here.
She meant she was going to take one of the cars back at the cabin and drive out of here, which would leave just one escape vehicle for the rest of them. Noelle, Wayne, and Dalton could escape with Brooke. Gavin could go to the campgrounds and help the others fight off the cannibal. Except he had no fucking weapon on him. He was trying to think this through quickly, knowing every second counted right now. With no weapon, if he returned to the campsite, he might be as good as dead. What would be the point of that? If he went back to the cabin, he could find a weapon, the fire poker or the axe in the kitchen, for example, and then drive one of the vehicles to the camp. He'd mess up some grass and a bunch of bushes in the woods, but fuck nature. His friends were in trouble. Without wasting any more time, he sprinted down the path in the same direction Brooke was going. Chapter 46. Vanessa wasn't sure what happened between being yanked to the ground and waking up to Fletcher and Fred pulling her to her feet, but she knew they'd saved her life. With her holding on to them for support, the three of them ran as fast as they could through the woods. Everything was blurry and spinning in Vanessa's vision.
Let each note be a step inward toward calm. Enjoy this musical break before we continue. Thank you for your time and presence.
Oh baby, could you let me know I'm on your mind? A girl like me is hard to find. Oh baby, don't hold back tonight. I know that baby, how your body feels right next to mine. All I wanna do is waste my time with you every single night. Alright, yeah. I love it, baby. Oh, you drive me crazy. I'll give it, baby. I love it, baby. Oh, you drive me crazy. Yeah, I'll give it, baby.
And she could barely feel her legs underneath her. The back of her head throbbed in the spot that had struck the ground. They climbed over a huge fallen oak tree, and Fletcher told her to lay down. For a moment, the three of them sat on the grass, trying to suck in air into their lungs as quietly as they could. Fred caught his breath first, and then raised up into a crouch to peer over the top of the tree trunk. The grass underneath him rustled at an alarming volume, but really, any sound was alarming given the situation. His head cleared the tree just enough for him to see the area ahead. There were no signs of the cannibal, and the hope in his heart that the gunshots had been the killer getting gunned down strengthened. Any sign of him? Fletcher whispered, too worried about making noise to get up and look for himself. Fred shook his head. No, nothing. Satisfied with that answer, Fletcher said to Vanessa, "Are you okay?"
Head hurts, but other than that, I'm okay. I'll be okay.
They were speaking in whispers that were just audible. Fletcher went to get up to look where Fred was looking, but stopped when in front of him he saw a figure approaching them from the trees. No fucking way, Fletcher thought, feeling a hot wetness at the front of his crotch. He screamed. Fred turned, saw the cannibal coming out of the woods, and started running. The others ran too. The chase was on once again. Vanessa ran into an area thick with thin trees and scruffy bushes. Her strategy was to get lost behind the wildly growing foliage, but she hadn't considered that the overgrown plants would make seeing the ground difficult. The front of her shoe struck an unseen root protruding out of the ground. Her ankle twisted from the sudden stop while the rest of her body kept falling forward. Vanessa yelped like a chihuahua that had just gotten kicked. She stuck her arms out to keep from face-planting into the ground. The stumble gave Varius Caras enough time to catch up to her. He grabbed her by the ankle with one hand. With his other hand, he swung the machete down at her leg. She screamed. This time it was a loud, from deep down inside type of scream, as the blade chopped her leg off from the shin down. Ignacio stomped on her back to keep her from moving away. Vanessa screamed again, not just from the pain, but from the fear. She screamed so loud that she began to throw up. The morning's breakfast burrito and a deluge of bile poured out of her mouth. Using both hands, Varius Caras raised the machete over his head and then brought it down on her other leg. One whack was all it took, and the girl's leg was hacked off at relatively the same spot as the first. The cut veins spurted blood all over Ignacio's arms. It was hot and sticky and tickled against his skin. It tickled so much, he let out a small giggle. Meanwhile, Vanessa howled in pain one last time, dug her nails into the earth, and then her eyes rolled to the back of her head and she lost consciousness.
I am sorry,
Ignacio said, staring at the bloodbath on the grass left from his hacking job.
But this is what happens to bad Barbies.
Ignacio took off one of her pink Converse sneakers. They were tiny to him, like a little doll's shoe. A Barbie's shoe, if you will. He put it in the back pocket of his pants. He would present it to her later, after cleaning the splatters of blood from it, to make her feel more comfortable in the barn, to make her feel welcome. With one arm, Ignacio scooped her up. She was much lighter now. He carried her to a tree nearby, leaving a trail of blood behind them. Ignacio hung her onto a sturdy-looking branch from the collar of her shirt. He tugged on her waist to make sure she was on there securely. She was. Satisfied, Varius Caras started off through the woods. He was going to hunt them down and kill them before they could come back and take his Barbie away from him again. No way was he going to let that happen a second time. Ignacio was a dummy, but he wasn't that big of a dummy. Ignacio closed his eyes and focused his hearing to locate the others. He could hear two of them running. He could hear their shoes beating against the ground as they ran. Hear the leaves rustling and twigs swaying as they blew past them. It was like the trees, no, like the woods themselves were on his side, whispering where the prey was to him. He located 3 of them. One of them had just gone through a window of one of the cabins. He could hear the kid's elevated heartbeat. It was faint, but there was no rhythm like that of a panicked human heartbeat. A second one had just fired up a car. That one was going to get away, but that was okay. There was nothing he could do about that. The third one was closer, running through the trees. He was slowing down, though, and Ignacio knew which way to go to cut him off. He started after this one first. These next ones weren't like Ignacio's Barbie. These he was going to kill for the thrills. Varias Caras took full control of the reins now. Vanessa's screams echoed throughout the forest. Each one was worse than the last, and each one twisting his stomach up into a tighter knot. Fred couldn't contain it anymore. He had to stop. It was a 1-2 punch of imagining what was happening to Vanessa and the strain from sprinting that made Fred drop to his knees and vomit. The retching came all the way from the very bottom of his stomach. It came out so violently and strong that his head felt like it was going to burst. Fred finished throwing up with a cough and wiped the saliva and throw-up from his mouth with the back of his hand. The worst wasn't over for Fred Myers yet, though. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Varias Caras coming after him through the trees. He must have taken some shortcut. Again. Or maybe he was a ghost. Hadn't the old man mentioned something about ghosts? Fred forced himself to start running on wobbly legs, feeling like he was going to fall over at any moment. Varias Caras power-walked after him. The kid must have found a second wind because he was moving quickly now. It was time to change tactics. He took the knife out from his back pocket, aimed it at the leg, and launched it through the air. The blade went through the back of Fred's knee and immediately took his leg out from under him. "Oh, fuck!" Fred yelled, dropping down to his good knee. He reached around to pull the knife from his leg. Varias Caras leapt forward and grabbed Fred by the shirt before the kid realized it. He lifted him into the air with both hands. The kid was light. Not as light as the Barbie, but light enough for him to pick up over his head like he was a pro weightlifter. Then, Varias Caras did a motion similar to a forward lunge, so that his knee was bent and at the same time slammed the boy down onto his knee, back first. Fred's spine snapped and he died instantly. Varias Caras let the boy's dead weight roll off his knee. He got up, pulling the knife from the dead kid's leg as he did so. Varias Caras closed his eyes and focused his ears to locate the others. This close to the campgrounds, his super hearing was even more extraordinary. He could hear the heartbeat of the camper hiding in the cabin. The others were further away, almost inaudible to him. He probably wouldn't be able to catch them. Oh well, not like it mattered too much. There were enough dead bodies to feed him for weeks already, and he was going to kill the one hiding at the camp, too. Varias Caras kept his ears homed on the camper's heartbeat as he trudged towards the cabins, noticing that the pace was slowing. The person must feel safe in their hiding spot. But in a matter of moments, they wouldn't feel that safety anymore. Fletcher found himself in one of the larger cabins that had multiple rooms hiding underneath a bed. His skin was crawling from sharing a space with a bunch of dust bunnies and rodent droppings, but it was better than being exposed. He could barely remember how he ended up here. One minute, he was watching the cannibal coming out of the woods after them. The next, he was in this cabin looking for a hiding spot. The bed seemed as perfect a hiding spot as possible. It was in the middle of the room so that if the cannibal came in through the front door, he could slip out the side closest to the window and jump out of it. If he came in through the window, which Fletcher had already opened in preparation for scenario number 1, then he would slip out the other side of the bed and run out the front door. The more his heart slowed to a regular rhythm, the more convinced he was this was a solid plan of survival. Shit, he might not even need it. The killer might not even be able to find him and give up looking for him. He couldn't remember if the guy was chasing him or Fred or Vanessa, but he knew they'd all ran in different directions. That much he did recall. looking over his shoulder and seeing the other two running deeper into the woods. By how it seemed, their assailant hadn't come after him. He'd been under this bed for a while. 15 minutes, maybe less, maybe more. Time didn't exactly operate the same when you were in danger of being murdered. The only thing he was sure of was the quietness that surrounded him. Some bugs buzzed their song in the bushes outside, but besides that, he hadn't heard a thing. No leaves rustling or grass being moved. Not even birds in the trees or a mouse running around. It was a stillness so prominent that it seemed to have stopped time. Fletcher wondered if when he finally crawled out from underneath this bed and went back to the real world, if it would be years in the future. He wondered if maybe he'd found some magical spot in the woods where time operated differently than the rest of the universe. A loud bang at the front of the cabin made these stoner thoughts disperse from Fletcher's mind. He realized he wasn't as safe as he thought. Before he could crawl from underneath the bed and escape out the window as he'd been planning, he heard heavy, quick footfalls just outside the room he was in. The heartbeat got louder and louder the further he walked down the short corridor. Whenever Ignacio was searching for prey, it reminded him of playing hide-and-go-seek with the neighborhood kids when he was a child, and how good he was at it. That had been when he was really little, back before he or the other kids realized he was different. Before they stopped playing games with him and started calling him names like Big Retard or Tonto if they knew Spanish. Just like the kids back then, his prey didn't realize Ignacio's ability to hear better than anyone else. They thought their hiding spots were good, and maybe they were, if they were hiding from anyone other than him. The stakes were different when hunting and playing. Hide-and-go-seek, of course. Finding the neighborhood kids meant winning a game. Finding prey meant food. But the rush was just the same. Various Caras entered the room the hiding camper was in. He could hear his heartbeats coming from underneath the bed. To Ignacio's ear, it was as loud as someone hammering a nail into the floorboards. He heard the kid move, then rethink his movement and stop. Various Caras trudged over to the bed, hearing the pace of his victim's heartbeats increasing with each second. It was these moments that Various Caras lived for. The surge of power that coursed through him before murdering someone was like nothing else. When he looked into his victim's eyes and saw them pleading for mercy, when they were shaking in fear of his presence, when they screamed for their lives, he felt like a god. Various Caras crouched down and reached under the bed to pull the kid out, but his hand clasped around air. The kid had summoned up some courage at the last second and slipped out the other side of the bed. Various Caras hopped to his feet. The kid was running for the open window.
"You like window?"
Ignacio yelled at him. He jumped through the air, clearing the bed and the space between him and the kid in one giant leap. He wrapped his arms around Fletcher. Fletcher kicked at the air and threw a punch over his head at Various Caras, but there was no power to it. It was nothing more than a glancing blow. Various Caras picked him up off his feet and superplexed him, head first into the floor. Stars exploded in Fletcher's vision, and his limbs uselessly went limp as he laid on the ground. Various Caras went over to the window and closed it shut. Then he went back to Fletcher and lifted him up off the floor by his waistband with 2 hands. He swung his arms back and then launched Fletcher at the window. Fletcher went head first through the glass. Shards cut his body open as the rest of him flew through the broken window and landed outside the cabin in a crumpled, bleeding mess. Ignacio opened the window and climbed out of it. He took his time, knowing full well his prey was wounded and had no fight in him. He grabbed Fletcher by the hair. The kid's useless legs dragged across the floor as Ignacio pulled him to the window. Ignacio balanced the kid's neck on the sill, so that his head was inside the cabin, but the rest of his body was outside. The odd positioning woke something in Fletcher up, and he came to. What are you doing? No, no, no! Fletcher pleaded. He realized what was going to happen and started thrashing his arms and legs, but it did him no good, because Ignacio was pressing against his back with one strong arm that felt like a boulder was crushing him. Even if he had all his strength in him, Fletcher didn't think he'd be able to budge from underneath him. He closed his eyes and waited for it to be over.
I like window too,
Ignacio laughed. Then, with his free hand, slammed the window closed as hard as he could. Ignacio's strength forced the window to act like a guillotine, and Fletcher's neck was split in half. His head hit the cabin floor with a hollow thud, like someone dropping a head of cabbage, while his body slumped onto the grass outside. Ignacio danced around in a circle, clapping his hands over his head. The old man was dead. The two boys who had been with the Barbie were dead. He couldn't get the woman or the other girl in the group, but that was okay. He had the Barbie. It was time to celebrate Mama's birthday. Chapter 47. The area around the cabin was quiet, but now that Noelle was looking into the den through the very same window she'd escaped from, she knew why. She followed the splatters of dark, drying blood with her eyes, and saw the first head lying on the ground by the pool table. Dalton stared up at the ceiling, an expression of pained agony from Ignacio's punch frozen on his face. His blue hair was turning purple because of the blood that had seeped and mixed in with the dye. Next to the head was his body. The black of the flannel shirt, like his hair, was drenched from the pool of blood. She spotted the second head further into the room by one of the walls. Even though this head was face down, she knew it belonged to Wayne. A pang of guilt struck her heart as her empty words of telling him they'd be okay echoed in her mind. She wanted to crumple to the ground and cry, but she knew she had to stay strong if she was going to survive this. Then she heard sobs coming from the woods. Sobs that were loud enough to be confused with screams, and she turned to see Brooke coming up the path her and the others had used to go into the woods earlier. It had been just this morning, but it felt like that had happened an eon ago. Mascara ran down Brooke's cheeks in dark rivulets. Something had happened in the woods, and something told Noelle it had to do with the man who'd murdered Dalton and Wayne.
Brooke!
Noelle called to her. She looked over at the side of the cabin where Noelle stood, and then shuffled toward her. They met at the front of the vehicles and threw their arms around each other.
Brooke, what happened?
Noelle asked.
A crazy guy came out of the woods.
Brooke buried her head into Noelle's shoulder and cried harder. After a few seconds of that, she raised her head up.
And then there were gunshots. Oh, God, it was awful. Where's Dalton?
Noelle shook her head.
He didn't make it, Brooke. What do you mean?
Brooke let go of her and stepped back, her eyes huge.
What do you mean he didn't make it?
She sucked in a deep breath and was ready to tell her it all in one go, when over her shoulder, Noelle saw Gavin racing out of the woods. Unlike Brooke's face, his was full of color. It was a red that was somehow pale and vibrant at the same time, like the color of a cherry bomb firecracker. "What are you two doing?" he yelled at the girls. "We gotta get going." Gavin ran past them without slowing down.
Gavin, stop!
Noelle yelled, and started after him. He'd hopped over the porch steps in one hurried leap and was at the top of them when he stopped and turned to Noelle. "What? Where are the others? Where's Wayne?"
"He didn't make it, Gav,"
Noelle said, using the same phrase she had telling Brooke about her cousin.
"I'm sorry."
Gavin shook his head, and his face contorted with emotion. "What the fuck are you talking about, Noelle? Didn't make—" It hit him. Hit him like a sledgehammer to his heart. Noelle knew his pain very well, but she needed answers.
"What happened in the woods?"
Ignoring her question, Gavin sprinted into the cabin.
"Gav, wait!"
Noelle called, but it was too late.
"They're dead, aren't they?"
Brooke said.
"Dalton and Wayne, they're dead." "Yes, Brooke, they are."
Noelle's shoulders slumped.
"We got attacked by a man with a machete." "The cannibal,"
Brooke said, and suddenly the temperature outside turned freezing cold.
"Cannibal? What are you talking about? We met an old man in the woods."
Brooke had calmed, maybe because she was in some sort of autopilot mode from the shock of hearing her cousin was dead, but she wasn't blubbering her words anymore.
"Said something about a cannibal out in the woods. Wanted us to be in some movie him and a girl he was with are making." "Okay," Noelle said, somewhat following. "Then what?" "Gavin got pissed before all that, though, and went back through the woods himself. The rest of us stayed to be in the movie, and we were walking to this barn out in the woods when the cannibal showed up. I ran back here and found Gavin on the trail, and now, they might all be dead."
Noelle was too stunned to respond. Brooke gulped, then continued.
"We have to get out of here, Noelle." "What about the others? Did you see what happened to them?" "No. I think they all ran a different direction. I don't know what happened to them, but we heard gunshots."
Brooke pointed her chin toward the cabin.
"I think he wants to take one of the cars back to the camp to help them."
Noelle felt her head spinning. There was so much going on, so much to take in. She wasn't sure what was happening or what would happen. But one thing she was certain about was that they were in danger out here. Gunshots? A maniac wielding a machete? Dead bodies in the cabin? None of this was good. Brooke started for the cabin. Noelle followed, worried about what condition Gavin would be in when they found him. He sprinted through the cabin, not caring about anything. Not caring if a whole cannibal family was in there wielding chainsaws ready to cut him up and turn him into their next meal. In that moment, he felt he could run through them, run through anything. He went into the den. At the far wall, he saw his little brother's head. Stupid mop top he'd always given him grief about and all. It looked fake, detached from the body that was always wearing a video game-themed or Mountain Dew t-shirt. It looked like plastic. It wasn't Wayne's. It couldn't have been. This was a joke from the others to get back at him for being a shithead. Everything about it had been a setup. Fletcher finding the map, running into the movie makers in the woods, the story about the cannibal. Yeah, that had to be it. This was some elaborate joke. They wanted to see him on the verge of tears. Everyone would pop out from their hiding spots and come into the den to laugh at him. Wayne would pick up the plastic head, duck his real head into his shirt, and laugh at him for thinking he'd been decapitated by a crazed killer. This was payback for him being an asshole to them all these years. A big scare. Ha ha, real funny, guys. They'd all laugh at his expense, and really, he wouldn't be mad. He deserved it, and after the initial embarrassment, he would laugh too. The old man and the woman, they were probably some sort of professional pranksters. He'd seen some of those people on YouTube before. Yeah, it made sense. There was no way that was Wayne's head lying by the wall over there. That's why it was face down, so it looked more convincing. He'd flip it over and there wouldn't even be a face on it. That's how fake it was. The others would come out soon, pointing and making fun of him, like some fucked up reverse surprise party where the goal isn't a nice gesture for the person. Instead, the goal was to make the person's knees weak and get them to feel all of the pain they'd inflicted on anyone in their life reflected back at them. And it worked. Their stupid prank worked like a charm, or a curse, whatever, because Gavin fell to his knees and felt as if someone had reached into his chest and pulled his heart out. He waited for the reveal of the joke to come. But it never came. He cried harder than he'd ever cried in his life. He closed his eyes, but his little brother's decapitated head was burned into his mind's eye, and it was all he could see behind the darkness of his eyelids. Chapter 48. Molly was driving the Subaru down the road they'd taken to get to Camp Slaughter. She was maybe a mile out from the campgrounds, maybe 2, maybe only half a mile. There was no way for her to tell. These damn woods all looked the same. The moment the cannibal showed up, the beauty and the serenity she'd been appreciating when they first entered the woods had vanished. After hearing the first screams of someone being murdered by him, the woods became a labyrinthian nightmare for her. She stopped the car and buried her face in her hands, resting her elbows against the steering wheel. She didn't cry, but she just sat there in that position for a good while, taking in deep breaths to try to get a hold of herself. It wasn't a time for emotions right now. It was time to think things through. She could continue driving, get out and find safety, call for help or find it somewhere. Hadn't there been a police station or something a few miles before they'd found Camp Slaughter? Maybe not. Maybe that was a false memory being recreated by her heart's desires or something like that. This whole mess was confusing. The one thing she was certain about was that she'd left Emerald behind. She'd seen him going the opposite way she ran, the wrong way by all accounts, straight toward where the cannibal was going. That idiot, she thought. But she'd heard the gunshot go off. It had been his pistol. Had to have been. A flicker of hope stirred in her that he was alive. If he was, the right thing to do would be to turn back to help him. And if anyone else had gotten away, shit, for all she knew, the college kids could have been packing and gunned down the cannibal themselves. They would need an escape vehicle too. Molly turned the key in the ignition, firing the Subaru's engine back on. The engine, starting up, sounded like a lion's roar, and it helped to psych her up for what she was about to do. Molly flipped a bitch on the road and started back to Camp Slaughter, flooring the accelerator. She hadn't fired a gun in ages, at least 10 years, but she assumed it was just like riding a bicycle. A skill that once you acquired, you never unlearned. Aim, shoot, and kill. It should be that easy, she hoped. The new Barbie was still hanging from the tree where he'd left her. Her eyes closed, her breathing slowing down. He needed to get her back to the barn and her wounds cleaned up soon. Ignacio unhooked her from the tree branch, then slumped her over his shoulder like a sandbag. Blood dripped to the ground from her injured legs as he took her back to the barn. In the barn, he had supplies he would use to cauterize the wound, bandage her up, and then wake her to start the party. This had become a messier job than he'd hoped for. The thought occurred to him that the blood was leaving behind a trail straight to him and where he kept his toys. But that was fine. He'd come back to wash it off the grass when he was done fixing up the new Barbie. He didn't think either of the girls who'd gotten away would be coming back. They'd been terrified when they ran away, and the police wouldn't be here for a good while, if ever. They might not even be able to find the place. Not a lot of people came by the campgrounds. Ignacio pulled the barn doors open. The old Barbie had moved into the darkest corner that her chains allowed her to, but he could see the yellow glow of her eyes peering back at him. Could sense her fear in the air, too. He stuck his tongue out past the mouth hole of the mask and licked the air. Sweet and ripe. A hollowness began to grow in his heart at the thought he would slaughter her at the end of the night. Various Caras walked through the barn and placed the new Barbie on the floor near the chains he'd set up yesterday. The new Barbie was out cold, not a muscle moving. There was no point in restraining her just yet. Ignacio took the box of matches out of his pants, lit one, and then went over to light the torches. He'd need light to fix the new Barbie up. While her captor was rummaging through a rusty filing cabinet where he kept medical supplies, Nadine stared at the young girl. The girl's legs had been cut off, just how her feet had been. Except this was worse, because her legs were cut off from the middle of the shins down. Blood gushed out of the holes with no signs of stopping, and Nadine wondered if the girl was going to stay alive much longer. The thought made her cry. She tried to stifle it by pressing her lips together, but that did nothing. She sobbed and heaved at seeing the poor girl laying there, out cold. This was worse than she'd imagined it would be. Then, ice-cold fingers of fear clutched around her heart tighter as she wondered what that meant for her. Her crying grew louder and more rapid, and she was sure that it was going to set various Caras off the deep end as it had before. But it didn't do anything. The most attention of his it drew was that he glanced away from the cabinet he was rummaging through. Then he went back to his task. He had a new toy, a new Barbie. He didn't care about Nadine anymore. I'm old, Nadine thought. Old toys get thrown out. She gulped, looked over at the machete on his back, still stained with blood from his last victims, no doubt. Nadine felt another touch from Fear's hands. This one wrapped around her throat and squeezed it shut, as she realized she would be dead soon enough. Chapter 49.
Gav, come on, let's go,
Noelle pleaded. Outside the cabin, they heard Brooke start up Fletcher's Jeep. She hadn't even bothered to come into the den to see her cousin. She scooped the keys up from the kitchen counter and ran back outside to escape out of the woods. While doing this, she'd called into the den to Noelle and Gavin, telling them she was going to call the police the moment her cell phone had service, and kept reminding them that they were free to come with her. Noelle silently turned down her offer, because the guilt of running away and leaving Wayne and Dalton to die still crushed her. She needed to be valiant, as Rachel had said. She wasn't going to let Gavin go back to the camp by himself and get killed. At the very least, she was going to try to convince him to escape out of here with her in the other vehicle. But before that could happen, she needed him to get control of himself. He was sitting on the floor, hunched over and crying into his hands. Noelle was kneeling over him and rubbing his shoulders. Everything she'd tried to get him to compose himself had failed. Really, though, there was nothing that would have worked, because there was nothing that could fix the grief of seeing the remains of a loved one's murder. Then it happened suddenly. Gavin stopped crying. From full throttle weeping to zero in an instant. He shook his head, rubbed his puffy eyes, and sighed, I'm going back to the camp.
No, Gav,
Noelle argued.
Think about this. Brooke told me what happened. The same cannibal did this.
I don't care. I'm going. He brushed Noelle's hand off his shoulders and got to his feet. You can't stop me, so shut up. Go with Brooke if you're scared.
It's no time to be a tough guy, Gavin,
Noelle said, getting in front of him. Out of my way, Noelle. There was an edge to his voice. I'm going back to kill this fucker myself.
You don't have a weapon.
They heard the Jeep's tires crunching on the gravel outside the window as Brooke pulled out of the driveway. The sound got fainter and fainter as Brooke escaped, leaving them with only one car. I'll find a weapon, Gavin said and started walking around her.
What if he's already dead? What if the gunshots you heard meant someone killed him? We'd just be wasting time.
Then I'll piss on his corpse, Gavin said. He needed to quench his thirst for revenge in any way possible.
We should let the police handle this. Think this through. I know you're mad and everything, but just stop and think.
You think he stopped and thought about killing my little brother, Noelle? Gavin had been walking out of the room but stopped at the doorway. He turned to face her. His eyes were red and puffy, but a darkness hovered over his face. I guess you wouldn't know since you ran away and left him and Dalton to die, though, right?
That's not fair, Gav. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I panicked.
Yeah, well, I know what I'm doing.
You're going to get yourself killed.
If that cannibal doesn't kill me, my parents will anyway. Noelle wasn't sure if she imagined it or if it actually happened, but she saw a smirk flash across his face. And it was that phrase, that moment, that made her realize just how young they truly were. There are knives in the kitchen, Gavin told her, continuing out of the room. Grab one and meet me by the car, or stay here, or whatever you're going to do. Chapter 50. The blood and bodies told Molly everything she needed to know. She was the last survivor. She saw Emerald first. He was about 5 feet off the ground, hanging from a tree branch that had pierced through his abdomen. Gravity had slumped him over to the right side, and his neck was bent so his head rested against his shoulder on an angle that would have been uncomfortable if he were alive. The blood around the gaping hole in his stomach was turning into a thick maroon crust. Several yards away from where her business partner had been turned into a human shish kebab was one of the college kids. It was the scrawny one, the one who'd gotten into an argument with the muscled kid. His back was bent in half, and one didn't need to be an expert in anatomy to know his spinal cord was snapped, most likely in several places. It was like something out of a possession horror movie, where the director shows the audience how much the demon has taken over by twisting the person into unnatural positions. Only this wasn't special effects or a camera trick. This was an actual person's body curved into a U. Molly felt an uneasiness in her stomach. This was her first time seeing a murder scene, or dead bodies for that matter, and it was gruesome. But she had to stay strong. Now was not a time for weakness. She started for the barn, wishing her plan of finding the cannibal out in the open and running him over would have worked, but he was nowhere to be found. She was going to have to do this the old-fashioned way, the most dangerous way, and probably the stupidest way, too. She'd have to approach him and kill him with Emerald's revolver. At the front of the barn there was a trail of blood leading past the doors, which meant the cannibal had, at the very least, gone inside at some point. She hoped some of the blood she was seeing belonged to him. Maybe he'd retreated in there because he was badly wounded. And maybe it would be as easy as shooting him in the head from point blank. She couldn't go in just yet, though. It wouldn't be smart to just barge in. Better to investigate around some more. It was her own voice giving her the advice, but it was a skill she'd learned from Emerald. He'd always made sure to investigate what was in plain sight before barging in through any doors. Clues could be anywhere. Molly traced another trail of blood. It took her through a tangle of weeds and thorny branches that made small cuts on her shins that she ignored. The bloody trail led her to the oak tree Vanessa had been hanging from. The girl wasn't there, of course, but the pools of blood from her hacked-off legs were, nearly touching to form one bigger puddle. Molly looked up the tree, expecting to see a dead body dangling, but saw nothing. To her, this confirmed where the cannibal was, or at the very least, where he'd been after having killed Emerald and Fred. Maybe he'd just stored the body into the barn and then gone back to wherever the hell he stayed permanently. She considered this as she doubled back to the barn, back through the irritating thorns cutting her shins.
This is nothing compared to the pain Emerald must have felt, she thought, with a pang of both guilt and pain ringing in her heart. She got to the barn and froze, realizing the enormity of the task. The cannibal might be in there. She knew he'd gone through at least 3 people in a matter of minutes, and here she was with just a revolver about to take him on herself. Molly shook her head to rid the doubt out of it. She could do this. He was human, nothing more. A bullet to his head or his heart would end it. All he'd been wearing was a vest, cargo pants, and boots, and that disgusting mask on his face. No body armor she could remember. Then again, she'd only caught a glimpse of him. But still, the leather mask, as scary as it was, and as long as it might haunt her nightmares, wouldn't protect him from a bullet. An image of Emerald hanging skewered from the tree branch flashed into her head, and anger pushed past her fear. Molly drew the gun out of her pocket and checked the cylinder to make sure it was loaded. All 6 bullets were in there. She snapped the cylinder back into place, gripped the handle tight with one hand, and with the other, she drew the barn door's latch open. Chapter 51. He floored the accelerator, but the Honda wouldn't go any further. Its engine was too weak, and the frame was too low for it to push past the tangle of bushes under it. Gavin slammed his fist on the side of the steering wheel. "Fuck!" he screamed. "Fuck! Fuck!" His plan to drive back to Camp Slaughter wasn't going to work. The face of the salesman who'd sold him the car, who'd promised ice-cold AC and great gas mileage from the Honda, flashed into his mind, and he hated him in that moment. But that quickly faded away, because he knew the car salesman had nothing to do with what was happening. It was Gavin's fault. All his fault, and only his fault. No one else had even wanted to come on this stupid trip. He'd practically had to beg his best friend to come, for fuck's sake. "Come on, Fredster. It's our last summer before we turn into boring adults. Let's do it big." And all Fred wanted to do was hang out with this girl in the passenger seat next to him, who for some reason had gone along with his crazy, now failed, plan. If it wasn't for him and his stupid fucking ideas, Noelle and Fred wouldn't even be here. They'd be back in the burbs, maybe getting ice cream or having a picnic at some park. They'd be somewhere safe. Somewhere where cannibals didn't chase you through the woods to cut your head off, and weird old men didn't ask you to be in their YouTube videos. He'd done this to all of them. Noelle, Fred, Fletcher, Wayne, Brooke, Vanessa, Brooke's cousin. It was his fault they all got caught up in this shit. His mind wasn't letting itself entertain that others might be dead now. Not just his little brother and Dalton. Because the guilt of having brought them out here into this situation was enough.
Gav, we have to figure something else out, Noelle said, forcing herself to hold on to braveness that was quickly fading.
We're wasting time just sitting here.
He lifted his head off the steering wheel where he'd rested it in frustration. Yeah, you're right. But what? What can we do?
I don't know. Something, anything.
She didn't finish her sentence, but Gavin had an idea of what she wanted to say. Anything was better than sitting here, waiting for the cannibal to come kill them and eat them. Something popped into his head. The old man and the woman, they'd come into Camp Slaughter in a Subaru. That meant there was a way to get to the campgrounds by car. Gavin threw the car into reverse and then floored the accelerator. The bushes it was on top of sprung up to their regular size as the car shot back into the dirt trail. They hadn't gotten far down the path before they were stopped, so it wouldn't take long for them to return to Lakewood Cabin.
Gavin, what are you doing?
The suddenness of this reversal worried Noelle that his Plan B was even crazier than Plan A. The old man and the woman. They drove into the camp. I'm going to see if I can find the road they took to get there. I remember which way they came in from, so I think I can find it. I didn't say anything, Noelle thought, sitting back in the car seat. She took in a deep breath, letting the smell of pine trees and honeysuckles coming through the window fill her nostrils. Clutching the axe she got from the cabin tight against her chest, she wondered if this was the last time she'd ever smell summer again. Chapter 52. Variascaras was using a pair of tweezers to pull out the bullet lodged into his shoulder. It hadn't gone in too deep because his shoulder bone had stopped it, but it was in there nice and snug. He had to wiggle it around like a loose tooth to get it to start coming out. He let out short grunts of pain as he pulled the bullet out of the wound. It came out slicked with blood and hurt on its way out more than it had going in. Most of that had to do with the adrenaline of his hunting wearing off, but to Ignacio it was all the same. He dropped the bullet to the barn floor. It clattered and rolled, leaving little red stains in its wake. Luckily for Ignacio, that was the only bullet he had to deal with. The one that had gotten him around the ribs had torn through his body. He'd have to bandage the wound up so he'd stop leaking blood everywhere, but that was it. Before he could go over to where the medical supplies were to take care of that, he heard the barn door opening behind him. Someone was here. He hadn't heard the person coming to the barn because he'd had his guard down again. Estúpido. Ignacio turned around. The silhouette standing in the doorway was thin and hunched over, in a posture that suggested they were uncertain of what they were doing, and scared too. Ignacio could hear the person's heart beating in his ears now that he was focused on it. It beat loudly and fast. Ignacio's own heart started to beat rapidly when he saw the outline of the gun in the person's hand.
Who's there?
Ignacio shouted. Behind him, Nadine screamed as if in response to his question. But what made her scream was the same concern Ignacio had. The gun. A gun meant bullets would start flying while she was out here in the open, immobilized and unable to duck for cover.
Who's there? Tell me who there.
Ignacio's lips quivered. The person walked into the barn, getting lost in the pocket of darkness between the sunlight coming in through the open door and the torchlights. Ignacio felt his heart speeding up and the barn walls getting smaller. He wondered if this is how his prey felt before he killed them. He opened his mouth to ask the question a third time, but stopped himself as Molly stepped just short of arm's length. The torchlight shined over the revolver's metal. Ignacio swallowed. The barrel was pointed right at his chest. She was going to kill him.
On Mama's birthday.
He had to act quick. He threw the tweezers at her since it was the only thing he had in his hands, and Molly pulled the trigger. At the last minute, her aim was thrown off and the bullet hit him in the shoulder, the same one that was already damaged, but that didn't stop him. He jumped forward and grabbed Molly by the wrist of the hand holding the gun. Ignacio squeezed as hard as he could until he felt the wrist bone break. Molly screamed and dropped the revolver. Nadine saw the shiny metal object falling out of the woman's hands as varias caras attacked her. It slid across the floor as if it were on a track, as if destiny itself were pulling it closer to her. She couldn't believe her eyes when it finally stopped, and she got a good look at the object. It was a revolver. She crawled over to it, but the chain stopped her a few inches short of it. There was still some slack to them, though, and as she reached out, she pulled hard on her restraints. The metal cuffs dug into her skin, but it worked. Her hand curled around the gun, and it felt like the world was right once again. Varias caras had Molly in a bear hug and lifted her up off her feet. She felt like she was suddenly in a vice made of flesh that smelled like meat and grease. Molly tried kicking at his genitals, but without seeing where she was aiming, it was useless. Ignacio flexed his arms. There was a series of pops as bones broke in her body. Molly felt her ribcage shatter, and then her body felt like it was closing in on itself. Her organs felt like they were about to pop out of the nearest orifice. Then, varias caras relieved some of the pressure, only to pump his arms as hard as he could again. Crack, pop, snap. This time, it was the discs of her spine that made the noises as they were dislodged from the column and broke at the same time. Molly's eyes rolled to the back of her head. Her legs stopped kicking. Her arms stopped clawing at his mask. She was dead. Ignacio dropped her to the ground and fell back on his ass. He was out of breath, scared, hurt, and bleeding. Behind him, the old Barbie continued to scream at the top of her lungs.
Too much noise, too much noise.
He got up and ran over to the wall, smashing his head into it as hard as he could to try to drown out the sound and shake out the bad thoughts in his head, but it was no good. All he did was manage to make his head hurt. He pounded his fists against the wall and screamed, adding to the noise, adding to his anger. Mama's birthday was ruined. Nadine's screams were only a bluff to get him to come close enough for her to shoot him, but she hadn't expected him to charge the wall head first at full speed. The impact shook the entire barn, and for a second, Nadine thought she'd fucked up, and the whole structure was about to collapse on top of both of them.
Please don't, please.
God must have been hearing her pleas, because the barn stayed intact. Varias caras had fallen to his knees, but he was still conscious and started getting up to his feet. Nadine reached behind her where she'd put the revolver to keep it hidden until she was ready to use it. She felt the cool metal in her hands. This was going to be tricky. She would only have one shot to kill him. A Hail Mary. But her weapon this time was better than a porcelain lamp. Her throat felt like sandpaper when she gulped. Chapter 53.
I don't want to do this, Gavin,
Noelle finally said, as they drove down a narrow road that seemed to lead to nowhere. He'd been driving with the eyes of a person possessed, only this wasn't some demon that possessed Gavin. It was thoughts of killing the cannibal. He wasn't thinking clearly at all. Gavin slammed on the brakes and hit the button to unlock the doors. Then get the fuck out if you don't want to help me.
Listen to me, Gav. For 1 second, listen to what someone else is telling you.
Her tone took Gavin by surprise. It was the meanest and loudest he'd ever heard her, and stirred something in him. He shifted in his seat and said, What? What do you have to say?
You have no idea where this road leads,
she said, pointing out to the greenery ahead of them that looked like the rest of the woods they'd been dealing with.
You're gonna get us lost. Get yourself lost. Then what? Then what, Gavin? Your parents lose 2 children to these fucking woods?
Gavin gritted his teeth. He hadn't thought of that. He looked out the windshield, hoping that by some miracle they'd see the camp slaughter sign, the one with the fading family, or anything hinting that they were on the right path, but there was nothing. She was right. It was like staring at an abyss of trees and leaves. He had no idea where this dirt road led, and they were at a point where it wasn't too late to turn back.
Brooke was right,
Noelle continued, seeing he was considering what she was saying.
We need to get the police out here. This is a job for them, not us. Not us, Gav. Do it for your brother. Wayne wouldn't want you to get killed for him, would he? Turn the car around before we get lost, Gav, please.
You're right, he said meekly. All they had was a fire poker and an axe, and his balls of steel. If it really came down to a confrontation, would any of that make a difference against a crazed cannibal? No, it wouldn't. As much as he didn't want to admit it, this was an awful plan that would just get them killed. He made a U-turn on the dirt road, having to drive several feet into the grass in the woods to complete it, and then headed back to Lakewood Cabin for the second time. From there, they would take the road they knew back to the main roads. It would be at least 40 minutes until they were in a town, and this didn't sit right with Gavin, because it was possible everyone they were leaving behind would be dead by then. But Noelle was right. There was no better option. Mama's birthday was ruined, but that didn't mean the fun had to end. Ignacio got control of himself and looked over at the new Barbie. Blood continued to come out of her wounds with no signs of stopping. She would probably bleed to death and die without him fixing her up, but so be it. There was too much work to do to worry about it. He had to save Mama's special day, and the only way to do that was by killing those who'd ruined it. Ignacio turned his attention to the old Barbie, whose back was pressed against the wall. She was looking at him with sunken eyes swimming in fear. A croak escaped between her dry, cracked, bleeding lips. Her bones could be seen through her yellowing skin. And her hair. Oh, God, her hair. It was awful. Stringy, thin, and greasy. She would have to be replaced soon. That was okay, though. It was the beginning of summer, and there would be plenty of campers around until early November. The old Barbie would be replaced well before that, but in the meantime, she would continue to be his toy. Ignacio walked over to her and licked her cheek like it was ice cream. The skin was wet and salty from her tears. "Shh, shh, shh, shh," he said to her.
Okay, everything okay.
He put his arm around her and cradled her close to him like a baby. Now, Nadine thought, now was the time. In a quick motion, Nadine reached behind her buttocks, grabbed the revolver, and swung her arm to aim at Varias Caras. But he was quick to get up and jump backward, making the shot just a bit harder. Nadine pulled the trigger, but the gun was too heavy, and her hands were too weak to hold a steady aim, and she missed. Too good to be true, Nadine thought, watching him hurtle through the air in what seemed like slow motion. But there was nothing she could do. This was it. This was the end for her. She was as sure of this as she'd ever been of anything. Varias Caras screamed as he grabbed her throat. He smashed her head against the wall, the impact so hard that the revolver flew out of her hands. The bones in her body seemed to all rattle at once. He brought her forward again, still holding her by the neck, then slammed her head into the wall as hard as he could. The wall shook. A bolt flew off from the metal where the cuffs were chained to, and the back of Nadine's head cracked open. The blood and bits of bone that stained the wall looked like raspberry pie being thrown against it. Nadine was dead, but Varias Caras had lost all control of himself. He slammed her against the wall a third time, making the mess of blood and brain matter on the wall bigger. He got up, wiped his hands on the front of his pants, and shook his head as if he couldn't believe what he'd done. Or rather, he couldn't believe what it had come to. In his outburst, his hearing sensitivity had gone all the way up, and he could hear a car engine out in the woods. It was about a half a mile out, maybe a little more, but he knew what it was. Nothing in the natural world of the woods sounded anything like the rumbling of a vehicle's engine. It was the sound of prey to him. Ignacio barged out of the barn, not bothering to open the door, and instead bashing it open with his good shoulder. He closed his eyes and focused on hearing to get the location of the car. The leaves the car rustled as it blew past them told Ignacio where it was and where it was heading. They were trying to get away, but they weren't far enough yet. He knew how to get ahead of them if he hurried through the woods. Ignacio ran into the barn. He needed more than his machete, which was still hanging on his back, for this one, because he wanted there to be carnage. These campers ruined Mama's birthday, and they would pay for it. He grabbed his chainsaw from the shelf and started off into the woods. Chapter 54. The advantage of traveling by foot was that he didn't need to stay on the cleared roadways. Ignacio cut through the trees, sprinting as fast as he could, revving the chainsaw. Meanwhile, he kept his hearing focused on the car. He could hear it whizzing through the roads. They were speeding. Going fast, fast, fast. But that was fine. His shortcut was faster. A few seconds later, he emerged out of the woods on the road in front of the car. He could hear where it was coming from better now. It would only be a couple of minutes until it came around the bend he was standing in. That was plenty of time to prepare. He found a branch on a tree that looked good enough for what he had planned and headed to it. It was Gavin and Noelle that Ignacio was waiting for around the bend and up the incline, because Brooke Florentine was long gone. She was flooring the accelerator, with getting to safety the only thing on her mind. Guilt of having left the others behind tried to invade her thoughts, but she didn't let it. The others had made their choices. Gavin and Noelle could have escaped with her, but instead decided to go back where the cannibal was, where gunshots had been heard. A stupid decision that they must have known would, Brooke thought, cost them their lives. And if it did, that had nothing to do with Brooke. She'd stop at the first store she saw and use their phone to call the police, to let them know that her friends were in the woods with a maniac trying to kill them. She'd have to do it that way because in the madness of arguing with Noelle and Gavin and scrambling out of the cabin, she'd forgotten her cell phone. The phone didn't matter to her as much as it once had. All that mattered was getting out of these damned woods and finding safety. The first car she'd see would look like a godsend. The first road sign would, too, for that matter. Gavin whipped the car around the bend so fast, Noelle was sure they were about to tip onto two tires. She let out a shriek, but it was nothing in comparison to the scream that came out of her next. The Honda went up the hill at the end of the bend, and there he was. The masked cannibal stood on top of a boulder waiting for them. He was holding a hefty tree branch like a spear, and it was aimed right at the car.
"Gavin, stop the car! Stop the car!"
Noelle screamed at the top of her lungs. Gavin had seen him at the same time she had, and was already slamming on the brakes. The brakes screeched as the tires kicked up dirt. The car started sliding to the right, but also kept going forward. Various cars threw the tree branch, pointed end first right at the windshield. It went through the glass, exploding shards everywhere, but it missed hitting either of them. Instead, it went between their seats and went through the car until getting lodged in the back seat. The impact of the tree branch made the car spin out of Gavin's control. They both screamed as the car went around and around like a fucked-up version of the tilt-a-whirl. It spun 3 full circles before the car finally smashed into a tree on the side of the road. Her vision was blurry. Her ears were ringing. Noelle had taken the brunt of the impact since the car struck the tree on the passenger side. Her right arm was broken in several places. Her head felt heavy. She wanted so badly to go to sleep. But then she blinked and saw Rachel appear on the hood of the car. Her little sister sat cross-legged on the crumpled-up hood, surrounded by gray smoke billowing out from the busted engine. There was a sheen to her skin, like she was glowing, and she was whole, with no wounds.
"You just gonna sit there, big sister? Or are you gonna help him?"
Rachel said. She was pointing at the driver's seat, where a semi-conscious Gavin was feeling around for the door handle to get out of the car. There was a large shard of glass sticking out from one of his shoulders, and his shirt was covered in blood, but the worst damage he sustained had been when his head bounced off the steering wheel on impact.
"It's just like our car accident,"
Noelle said to her sister. Rachel nodded.
"Here's your chance, Noelle, to make things right for yourself, to finally rid yourself of the guilt." I can hardly feel my body, Rach. I don't know if I have the energy." "Grab my hand,"
Rachel said, sticking her arm out.
"I can only do this once before I have to go." "What?" "Grab my hand, Noelle."
Rachel reached her hand through the windshield. Not just through one of the holes where glass was missing. Rachel's hand went through even the shards still clinging to the frame. Noelle grabbed her hand. It was warm, warmer than humanly possible, and in that instant realized why her sister didn't appear damaged like her usual hallucinations. Because this wasn't a hallucination. This actually was Rachel. It was her sister's ghost. These woods were haunted, and they'd brought Rachel's ghost to come help her. Noelle crawled through the windshield, the shards of glass still stuck to the car like teeth in a shark's mouth, and they cut her open in several places as Rachel pulled her onto the hood. The smoke was thick and she coughed, but held her composure. Rachel pointed into the car where the axe was resting on the dashboard. It must have slipped out of Noelle's hand on the impact of the crash and landed there.
"Don't forget that,"
Rachel said. Noelle reached through the windshield and grabbed the weapon. She turned to thank Rachel, but she was gone. Gavin unlocked the car door, rolled out of it, and fell to the ground. His back struck a big rock lying on the ground, but he didn't care. Other parts of his body hurt worse. He laid there for a moment, in a daze, but as his mind started to regroup, he remembered where he was and what was happening. He sat up and saw the cannibal tearing across the dirt road. He held the chainsaw over his head, ready to bring it down. Gavin reached into his shorts and pulled out the steak knife he'd grabbed from the kitchen. At the time, it seemed like a good idea, but with the danger now in front of him, he realized he would have been as good with a butter knife. Using the side of the car for support, he got to his feet and turned around in time to see the cannibal swing the chainsaw down at him. Gavin watched the chain spinning around the blade in a mesmerized state. He never thought that accepting death would be so calming. Putting her hips into the motion, Noelle swung the axe as hard as she could with her good arm. The axe went into Various Karas' chest, and the surprise of the attack took him off balance. He stumbled backward, tripped on his own 2 feet, and fell on his ass. The chainsaw flew out of his grip.
"We have to go!"
Noel screamed and pulled Gavin by the collar of his shirt, but he didn't move. His head had cleared, and he saw the cannibal was on the ground trying to pull the axe out of his chest. This was his moment to strike. Gavin shook his head at Noel and picked up the rock he'd fallen on when he got out of the car. It was about the size of a football and heavy enough to do damage. Gavin positioned the rock so the most jagged side of it was sticking out, and then ran towards the cannibal and leapt into the air. He smashed the rock against the side of his head. Ignacio slumped forward, the back of his head exposed. He was badly hurt. No way Gavin was going to let this opportunity go. This one was for Wayne. He brought the rock down as hard as he could on the cannibal's head. There was a thud, like a tennis ball striking a brick wall, and then varias caras fell sideways. Noel grabbed Gavin by his shirt again and pulled him. He didn't know what she was saying because his mind was processing a million thoughts, but he knew she was telling him to run. And as much as he wanted to kill him, as much as it would have been satisfying to pulverize his skull, he knew she was right. There was no promise this monster wasn't going to get up, grab one of the weapons, and take their heads off. Besides, she'd come back to save his sorry ass. He owed her. Gavin pulled Noel's hand off his shirt and squeezed it. Then, together, they ran into the woods as fast as their damaged bodies would let them. Chapter 55. Ignacio sat up. The back of his head was throbbing, pounding, like someone was knocking on the inside of his skull. The chainsaw lay a few feet from him. The motor slowed down to a purr and the chains were coming to a stop.
Stupid brain,
he scolded himself, because he couldn't remember what happened. He blinked and shook his head in frustration. He still couldn't remember. Then he saw the car. The passenger side was smooshed into the trunk of a massive oak tree that had held strong against the crash. The tree branch he'd thrown was sticking out of the middle of the windshield. He remembered now. He tried fighting them but lost. That's why his head hurt. That's why he was bleeding. But maybe he could still find them. Ignacio tried focusing his hearing, but it didn't work. He couldn't hear far away anymore. The knocks to his head must have done something to his brain, made it stupider. He walked over to the chainsaw and picked it up as it went dead silent. The tranquility of the woods returned and surrounded him. Mama's birthday was ruined. Both of his Barbies were dead, unless by some miracle the new one was alive. But he wasn't counting on that because he hadn't treated her wounds. She'd probably bled to death by now. And 2 of his prey had gotten away. They would tell on him. The police might believe them, too, because they were cut up and hurt. This wasn't how things were supposed to go.
Stupid Ignacio, you ruined everything.
He started back into the woods. He stopped at the front of the wrecked car and stared at it for a good while. This had been too much for him. He should have left those campers alone, but the desire for the new Barbie had gotten the best of him. All because she looked like Mama. And in an awful twist, he'd ruined Mama's special day trying to find a girl to replace the missing part of his heart. The one that was lost when those thieves had killed her in cold blood. Tears came down his eyes as he walked back to the farmhouse, shoulders slumped in defeat. They couldn't run anymore. There was no more energy left in them. They'd lost too much blood. They both fell onto a dirt road that was a little under a half-mile from where they fought the cannibal. Not that either of them knew how far they'd gone. They just knew they couldn't go any further. This was where they would die or be rescued. Silently, they both made up their minds about that. Gavin and Noelle were lying down on their stomachs. Their hands had let go of the others when they fell, but their outstretched fingers were inches away from touching. Noelle turned her head to face Gavin.
Are you okay?
Gavin shook his head. Are you?
Nope,
She said. Do you think any of the others survived? Gavin asked her.
No,
She said, and to her surprise a dry chuckle escaped between her lips.
I'm not even sure we survived.
With the last of his energy, Gavin curled his lips into a smile. Then he was out. Noelle closed her eyes, and shortly after, she went unconscious, too.
Dad, stop the truck!
Benji shouted. Bill Hutcherson was on his cell phone, trying to drive and figure out how to change the background image of his new iPhone X at the same time, to prove to his son his old man still had it. He looked up from the screen when he heard his son shouting and saw the two people lying in the middle of the road.
Holy smokes!
Bill yelled as he slammed the brakes and veered his truck off to the shoulder. Everything in the car, including the coins in the cup holders and the American flag air freshener hanging on the rearview mirror, moved to the right with the change in direction. The truck stopped at the side of the road, kicking up clumps of grass and dirt behind its tires. Bill took his camo hat off his head and wiped his brow with it. That was a close call. He would have run the two poor things over if Benji weren't with him. While his dad was catching his breath from nearly turning the two people laying on the street into roadkill, Benji slid out of the car. "Grab one of the rifles, boy," Bill shouted after him, then undid his seatbelt and climbed out of the car. Benji retrieved one of the rifles they had on the bed of the truck and approached the bodies. They were both disheveled and covered in blood, and he thought that was a bone sticking out of one of the girl's arms. Benji had seen a kid break his arm after falling out of a tree last year. This was nothing new to him, so he managed to keep his cool. He scanned the area for any hints of what might have happened to them, but there was none. Just trees, bushes, and a chipmunk scurrying on the ground a few yards away. Benji drew closer, then crouched down and grabbed the guy's wrist. There was a pulse. He grabbed the girl's good arm next, and also felt a pulse.
Dad,
he said as his old man approached him with a rifle of his own.
They're alive, Dad!
Bill crouched down over the bodies, and Benji moved away to give him more space. He checked them for life, just as his son had done. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, glad that the two were alive. But first and foremost, he was proud of his boy for knowing what to do in this situation. "Come on, Benji. Help me load him into the truck. It'll be no different than how we carry the deer." Benji grabbed Gavin's legs while Bill hauled him up by the arms. On a deer, Bill would have been pulling by the front legs, but it was the same idea. Bill counted to 3, then lifted him up, and they carried him to the back of the truck. Next, they picked Noelle up. It was a little trickier because of her broken arm, but Bill pressed his hip against her shoulder to bear some of the weight that way. A minute or so after they found them, they were both loaded into the back of the truck, still unconscious. Billy and Benji climbed back into their seats. They'd been on their way to fish at a remote river that was only 1.5 miles away from here, but it seemed God had changed their plans. Billy made a U-turn on the dirt road and drove the truck toward town to take their knocked-out passengers to the hospital.
"What a strange day, huh, Dad?"
Benji said. "Yeah," Bill responded. "Wonder what happened to him."
"Maybe a bear?"
Benji offered. "Maybe, son. Maybe." They didn't say another word to each other until they got to the hospital. The whole time, though, they speculated what could have happened to them. Out here, the possibilities were endless. Gavin was hallucinating. Had to be. There was no way he was on a stretcher right now, being carried through the doors of a hospital. This was all just an illusion his mind was creating to make it easier to accept death. Yeah, that had to be it. In reality, he was still laying somewhere in the woods. The cannibal with the chainsaw would come get him any second, chop him up and turn him into pork chops or bacon or whatever sick shit he did with the people he killed. Maybe he fucked them. He hoped he wouldn't do that to Noelle. She didn't deserve it. The thought of her made him lift his head up. "Lie down, young man. Stay calm. You're all right now." One of the medics carrying the stretcher, a man with a full gray head of hair, spoke to him gently. "You're okay now, son. Take it easy."
"Noelle,"
Gavin said, letting his head drop back down because it was too heavy to hold up.
"The girl's fine, sweetie."
This came from the other side of the stretcher, from a heavy-set black woman with a slight southern accent.
"Y'all are both going to be just fine."
And Gavin believed her. He believed that voice that was smooth and sweet as honey. Even though his whole body ached, and the wounds underneath the thick layer of bandages pulsed in throbbing pain, Gavin believed her. He closed his eyes and fell asleep in peace, knowing the nightmare was over. Epilogue. After treating his wounds, Ignacio spent the day collecting the bodies of people he'd killed. The old man hanging from the tree, the scrawny kid bent in half in the woods, the blue-haired guy back at Lakewood Cabin, and the two heads, and finally, the decapitated kid at the campsite. He brought them to the barn where the three dead women were. He cut Mama's look-alike's face off with a carving knife and folded it up in saran paper he got from the farmhouse. He put her face in his pocket for later. The other bodies he cut up for the parts he could use for meals, the thighs, the backs, the shoulders, the bellies, and put them in plastic bags. Then stacked the remains of the corpses into a pile in the middle of the barn. Next, he went to the farmhouse where he took out all of his necessities and treasured items, and loaded them into the car. The candles, the Jesus statue, his cooking dishes, his clothes, his boots, his masks, his machete, and, of course, the stick with Mama's head on it. He took the gallons of gasoline he had stocked up for the car, poured it all over the farmhouse, then lit a match and threw it inside. He took some of the remaining gas over to the barn and did the same thing. Both buildings would burn down. Maybe they'd cause a forest fire. Maybe they'd burn miles and miles of the place he used to call home. But he didn't care. He'd be long gone from here by then. And as long as he had his Mama's head, anywhere could be home for Ignacio. It was around 6 p.m. when reports of people seeing smoke from the highway came in, and past midnight by the time the firefighters put the last of the flames out. The fire had spread from the barn all the way through the entire camp by means of dry brush and grass and trees, so when the fire trucks arrived on the scene, the campgrounds were up in a blaze. Around the time the firefighters were wrapping things up, Gavin and Noelle were talking to the police. When they arrived at the location to investigate what the two kids had told them, the only things left were burned trees, charred husks of wood, and ashes that were soaked wet from the fire truck's hoses, but nothing that would lead them to the person who murdered the campers. All the officials had read the sign, the only thing that hadn't been engulfed in flames, when they drove to the site. Camp Slaughter. And all of them, independently of each other, thought it was a good thing the place had burned down. There was something strange about it, but they couldn't quite put it into words. Just a feeling. Like they were being watched from the shadows. None of them spoke about it to the others, worried they'd sound foolish. Besides, it wasn't like they were going to catch the murderer anyway. Even with all the blood they'd found back at Lakewood Cabin, there wasn't much of a chance they'd catch the culprit. Out here, this deep in the woods, he could have been hiding anywhere. This has been Camp Slaughter, written by Sergio Gomez, narrated by Jeremy Frazier.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.